Edmund Vale did not knock. He never knocked. Knocking implied that the person on the other side had some right to decide so whether he entered, and Edmund Vale had not operated that way in 23 years of doing business in Red Hollow, Wyoming. He pushed open the door to the land office with the flat of his palm, let it swing wide enough to bang against the interior wall, and walked straight to the counter where a nervous young clerk named Grady was trying very hard not to make eye contact. "The Brooks loan," Edmund said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Pull it." Grady fumbled with the filing drawer, his fingers clumsy against the hanging tabs. He found the folder, set it on the counter, and stepped back like he was giving a predator room to feed. Edmund opened it. He read through the terms he already knew by heart because he had written them, had them notarized by a judge who owed him 2 favors, and filed them under a clause that most ranchers in this county had never bothered to read. The balloon payment, due in full. 60 days from the date of filing, which was he checked the stamp 62 days ago. He closed the folder. "Send the notice to Brooks Ranch by end of week," Edmund said. "Make sure it's signed. Make sure it's legal. And make sure it's delivered by someone who can testify in court that it was received." Grady opened his mouth. "Don't," Edmund said. Grady closed it. Edmund picked up his hat from the counter, set it back on his head, and walked out into the gray morning light of Red Hollow without another word. He had just signed the death warrant for a struggling ranch, a struggling man, and whatever ridiculous hope that Eastern woman had hauled into town with her single carpetbag and her quiet eyes. He figured it would be over before the first snow. He had no idea how wrong he was. If you had stood on the platform at the Red Hollow Stage Depot on that particular Tuesday in late September, you would have seen something the town talked about for weeks afterward, though not for the reasons anyone expected. The stage from Laramie arrived 40 minutes behind schedule, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the woman who stepped down from it. She came out last. Not because she was afraid, but because she had waited for the dust to settle, and because she had taken a moment inside the coach to straighten her dress and check that her hat was pinned correctly. She had her own bag. She carried it herself, both hands gripping the worn leather handle, and she set it down on the platform boards with a soft but final thud that seemed to say, "I am here now. This is where I am." Her name was Eliza Hartwell. She was 34 years old, originally from a mill town in western Pennsylvania, and she had answered a letter that a Wyoming rancher named Nathaniel Brooks had placed through a correspondence agency 8 months prior. The letter had been careful and honest in a way she hadn't expected from such an ad. He hadn't described himself as successful. He hadn't promised her ease or comfort. He had written, "I have a ranch that is struggling and a life that is quiet in all the wrong ways. I am not a man given to poetry, but I think I would like to share meals with someone again, and I would want her to know what she is coming into before she comes." She had written back. They had exchanged 6 letters, and then, because she was 34, and had spent 12 years managing her dead father's household accounts and raising a younger sister who no longer needed her, she had packed 1 bag and bought a ticket west. The people on the platform that Tuesday saw a woman who was heavier than fashion approved of, wearing a dress that was clean but not new, with no jewelry except a small brooch at her collar. They saw someone who looked like she had worked with her hands. They saw someone who was not young in the way frontier towns expected their mail-order brides to be young fresh, and a little frightened and grateful for whatever they got. What they did not see, because it was not visible from the outside, was that Eliza Hartwell had not been frightened of anything in a very long time. A man detached himself from the small crowd near the depot wall and came toward her. He was taller than she'd imagined from his letters, leaner, with a face that had been in the weather for many years and showed every one of them. He walked with a slight forward lean like a man perpetually headed into wind. His hat was clean. His boots were not. He stopped 2 feet from her and looked at her with a directness she appreciated. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "It wasn't a question, Mr. Brooks," she said. They looked at each other for a moment. Not the romantic kind of looking that stories invented afterward. The honest kind, 2 adults taking stock, each trying to read whether the letters had been accurate, or whether they had both, in their own ways, presented a version of themselves that was easier to accept on paper. From somewhere near the depot wall, a woman's voice said something low and amused. A man laughed. Eliza didn't turn toward it. She kept her eyes on Nathaniel. "You carried your own bag," he said. "I packed it," she said. "Seemed reasonable I should carry it." Another laugh from the crowd, louder this time. Someone said something about Eastern women and big ideas. Someone else, a woman with a sharp voice, said something about the size of her, and wasn't that something? The words weren't quite loud enough to demand direct response, which was exactly the way that particular kind of cruelty worked. It floated just at the edge of accountability, present enough to sting, vague enough to deny. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He started to say something. Don't, Eliza said quietly. He looked at her. Not on my account, she said. If you respond to it, it becomes a thing. Right now, it's just noise. He considered that. After a moment, he reached down and picked up her bag anyway, not because she couldn't carry it, but because he was raised a certain way and couldn't entirely help it. She let him. That seemed like a reasonable compromise for a first meeting. Stage horses need water, he said, which was not what he meant, but was the easiest way to explain that they should move. Then let's move, she said. They walked away from the platform together, and the laughter behind them was already shifting into something more uncertain, because ridicule works best when its subject flinches, and Eliza Hartwell had not flinched even slightly. The wagon road out of Red Hollow toward Brooks Ranch was 40 minutes of hard-packed clay and scattered rock, and it wound through scrub brush and dry grass that bent flat in the September wind. Nathaniel drove. Eliza sat beside him on the bench and watched the land. She did not fill the silence with nervous chatter, which surprised him. Most people, in his experience, couldn't tolerate silence in unfamiliar company. They talked to cover the discomfort. She just watched the landscape with an attention that looked almost professional. It's not what you expected, he said after a while. It came out more defensive than he intended. I didn't expect anything specific, she said. I read what you wrote. The land sounds like what it is. And what is it? She thought about that. Difficult, she said, but not impossible. He wasn't sure whether she was talking about the land or something else entirely. He let it sit. After another stretch of road, she said, Your letter mentioned workers. How many? 4 at the moment. Had 6. Lost 2 when the money got thin, they found other work. The 4 who stayed are, he paused, choosing words carefully. They're good men. Tired men. There's a difference between those two things, but right now they're both. Who runs the household? Nobody, technically. I manage what needs managing. There hasn't been a woman in that house in 3 years. She nodded like she was cataloging information. You're doing math in your head, he said. Not accusing. Just noticing. I'm doing inventory, she said. I need to understand what's there before I can think about what's missing. He had not expected that. He'd expected he wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected. Someone who would need to be settled in, shown around, eased into the reality of the place. Someone for whom the first days would be largely ceremonial while she found her footing. He had been prepared to be patient about it. He revised that expectation now. The finances, she said. You mentioned in your 3rd letter that there was debt. Specifically, you mentioned a loan from 18 months ago. I'd like to understand the terms when you're comfortable sharing them. Nathaniel's hands tightened on the reins, not dramatically. Just slightly. That's not usually first-day conversation. No, she agreed. But it's relevant. If the ranch is in real trouble, I'd rather know before I start making decisions about kitchen gardens. He looked at her sideways. I'm not here to manage your house and stay out of your business, she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. I can do that if that's what you need. But that's not what your letter sounded like you needed. It was the most direct thing anyone had said to him in months, maybe longer. He'd gotten so used to people talking around things, the ranch hands choosing their words carefully, the shopkeepers in town being professionally cheerful, the banker using language that meant one thing on the surface and something much worse underneath. That plain speech hit him like cold water. The loan is with Edmund Vale's outfit, he said, not the bank directly. Vale holds the paper through a land company he controls. The terms seemed reasonable when I signed. I've since learned to read more carefully. Something shifted in Eliza's expression, not alarm. Something more specific than alarm. Recognition. Edmund Vale, she said. You know him? No, but I've known his type. What are the terms? He told her. He laid out the structure of the loan, the interest that compounded quarterly, the balloon clause he hadn't fully understood at signing. He told her the amount. He told her the timeline. She was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that he began to regret saying it all on the first day. Then she said, When did you find out about the balloon clause? 4 months ago, when I asked the bank to refinance and they pulled the original document. And how long until it's due? If my count is right, he stopped. About 2 months, she let out a slow breath, not panicked, just measured. The breath of someone who had just seen the size of a problem clearly for the first time and was deciding to stand in relation to it. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. That's a real problem, she said. But it's not the only problem, and it's not an immediate problem yet. 2 months is time enough if we use it correctly. We, he said. She looked at him directly. You sent for a partner, Mr. Brooks. Even if you called it something else in the advertisement. He didn't argue that, because she was right, and he had known it when he wrote the letter, and he'd been hoping someone would show up who understood it without him having to explain. He hadn't expected her to understand it before they'd reached the ranch. Brooks Ranch sat at the end of a long approach road, framed by low hills to the north and an open plain to the south that ran all the way to a line of distant cottonwoods, marking a creek that was currently running low. The main house was solid, built well, originally by someone who knew what they were doing, but it showed 3 years of deferred maintenance in the way that buildings do when the person living in them has stopped noticing. A shutter hanging at an angle, paint gone gray where it had once been white, a porch step that had been repaired with the wrong kind of wood and was already warping. The barn was better kept. That told her something about Nathaniel's priorities, which made sense. You kept the barn working because the animals didn't understand deferred maintenance. The house could wait. The horses couldn't. 4 men were visible near the corral when the wagon came up the approach. They stopped what they were doing and looked. The looking had that careful quality that Eliza had learned to read, the kind that meant people were trying to form an opinion and knew they were forming it and were slightly uncomfortable about the process. Nathaniel brought the wagon to a stop and got down, and then, after a brief moment of figuring out whether to wait for her to climb down herself or offer a hand, and apparently deciding that the hand was the less awkward option, offered a hand. She took it, got down. "This is Miss Hartwell," Nathaniel said to the 4 men, who had drifted closer in the way that people do when they're curious, but don't want to admit it. She's here," he stopped. The sentence had run out of structure. A man with a heavy gray mustache and weathered hands that looked like they'd been carved from old wood said, "Welcome to Red Hollow, ma'am." His name was Clem, she would learn. He had been with the ranch for 9 years and had the particular loyalty of a man who had nowhere better to be, and had made his peace with that. "Thank you," Eliza said. She looked around the yard with the same inventorying attention she'd been giving the road. "The corral gate on the left is hanging wrong," she said. "Is that a hinge or a post problem?" Silence. Then Clem said, "Carefully, post, ma'am." "We've been meaning to—" "I'm not criticizing," she said. "Just noting. I'm trying to understand what needs doing." She looked at Nathaniel. "Can you show me the house?" He showed her the house. It was functional and bare and had the particular smells of a place where a man had been living alone, not dirty, exactly, but stripped down to minimum. The kitchen was the worst of it. Not because it was filthy, but because it was visibly unused in any meaningful way. A tin of crackers, salt pork coffee, a pot that had seen a lot of the same meals. She opened 3 cabinets, closed them, opened a 4th. "Is there a root cellar?" she asked. 50 yards east of the house. "What's in it?" "Some potatoes. Probably still good. Canning from 2 summers ago. I'm not sure what's still. I'll look this afternoon," she said. "Tonight I'll cook a meal for everyone. A real one. I need to understand the supply situation before I can plan anything, but I can work with what's here. You don't have to do that on your first day." "I know I don't have to," she said, without particular emphasis. "I want to." He was quiet. "The loan papers," she said. "Tonight after dinner I'd like to see the original document. And whatever accounting records you have for the ranch operation. Revenue, expenses, supply costs. All of it." "That's a lot of reading." "I read fast," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Standing in the middle of his stripped-down kitchen, in the house that had been running on empty for 3 years, he looked at this woman who had arrived with 1 bag and spent 40 minutes on a wagon bench asking about balloon payment clauses, and he felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Not attraction, exactly. Not yet. Something more basic. Something that felt embarrassingly like relief. "All right," he said. Dinner that evening was the first real meal the ranch hands had eaten in longer than any of them wanted to admit. Eliza had found more in the root cellar than expected: onions, dried beans, a good quantity of preserved tomatoes, a crock of lard that was still usable. She had located a cast-iron pot that had been stored under the porch for reasons nobody could explain and scrubbed it clean in 20 minutes. She made a stew that was not elaborate but was hot and thick and seasoned with the herbs she'd found growing half-wild at the back of the house, apparently survivors of some earlier tenant's kitchen garden. She set it out in the main room on the long table that served as the ranch's communal space. The men came in dirty and tired and sat down without speaking much, and then they ate, and for a while there was no sound in the room except spoons against bowls and the wind outside. Clem ate most of a second bowl before he said anything. Then he set his spoon down and looked at Eliza across the table with an expression that was trying to be neutral but wasn't quite managing it. "Where'd you learn to cook?" he asked. "Necessity," she said. "Same place most people learn anything." A younger hand named Pete, who couldn't have been more than 22 and had the particular anxiety of a young man trying to figure out how to behave correctly in a new social situation, said, "It's real good, ma'am." "Thank you, Pete." He went red to the ears, stared at his bowl. Nathaniel watched all of this from his end of the table. He had eaten 2 full bowls and would have eaten a third, but felt like that would reveal something about the past 3 years that he preferred to keep private. He watched Eliza manage the room, without appearing to manage it, answering questions without performing warmth, being present without demanding attention, and he thought about the woman at the depot platform who had told him, very quietly, "Don't." After dinner, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen had been straightened, Nathaniel brought out the accounts. He spread them on the table: ledgers, loose papers, the original loan document from Edmund Vale's land company, a folder of supply invoices going back 2 years. He felt vaguely exposed doing it, the way a person does when they let someone see the inside of something they've been struggling with alone. Eliza sat down across from him and began to read. She read without interruption for 45 minutes. She made occasional marks in the margin of a small notebook she'd produced from her bag. She asked 2 questions during that time, one about a supply account that didn't match an invoice, one about whether a particular fence repair had been contracted out or done by the hands. Nathaniel answered both. At the end of 45 minutes, she set down her pen. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, which was becoming a kind of vocabulary between them. A shorthand for "I hear you. Keep going." "The loan is bad," she said. "You know that. The balloon clause is real and it's coming. But the loan isn't the root of the problem. The root of the problem is the supply account." He frowned. "The supplies? You're paying 30% above market rate for feed. The invoices go through a company called Territorial Provisions. I'm guessing that's Vale connected. I don't know. I'll find out. But if it is, you're being systematically bled on the operational side while the loan pressure keeps you from noticing. It's a common structure. You borrow under favorable seeming terms, and then the carrying costs get quietly inflated so you can never get ahead enough to pay down the principal." She said it matter-of-factly, the way she might describe a problem with a roof. Whoever structured this knew what they were doing. The room was very quiet. "The cattle numbers are also wrong," she said. "Your last head count versus the calving records, there's a gap of about 11 animals. That's not a counting error. That's either theft or animals you sold that aren't showing in the revenue ledger, which would mean someone was keeping 2 sets of books." Nathaniel put both hands flat on the table and looked at her. "You got all of that from 2 years of ledgers in 45 minutes. I managed my father's mill accounts for 7 years, she said. Before that, I worked 2 summers as a bookkeeper's assistant. Numbers have patterns. When the patterns break, something happened." He sat back in his chair. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the house with that particular Wyoming insistence that felt personal, like the weather was reminding you it could outlast you. He thought about Edmund Vale walking into the land office. He thought about the loan terms he'd signed without reading carefully enough. He thought about 11 missing cattle and 30% supply markups and 2 years of being bled so slowly he hadn't felt the individual cuts, only the accumulated loss. "What do we do?" he said. "Tonight? Nothing. Tonight you sleep." She closed the ledger. "Tomorrow I start tracing the supply accounts. I want to know who owns Territorial Provisions. And I want to ride the fence line if there's been theft. There'll be evidence somewhere." "You ride?" "I haven't in a while. But yes." He looked at her across the table, this woman who had arrived 8 hours ago with 1 bag and had already found what 2 years of his own management had missed. He wanted to say something that matched the moment. He couldn't find the words. "The step on the porch," she said, standing. "The warped one. Do you have the right lumber for it?" "In the barn, probably. Clem would know. I'll ask him tomorrow." She picked up her notebook. "Good night, Mr. Brooks." "Good night," he said. And then, because it seemed inadequate, and he couldn't think of anything more adequate, "Thank you for the dinner." "It was just a stew," she said. "It was the first real meal in this house since—" He stopped. "It's been a while." She paused at the door. She didn't look back at him, but she paused. "Then tomorrow I'll make something better," she said, and went to the room he'd shown her earlier, closed the door quietly behind her, and left Nathaniel sitting alone at the table with his accounts spread out in front of him and, for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, something that felt cautiously, tentatively like hope. 3 days after Eliza's arrival, Red Hollow's opinion of her had not improved. If anything, it had organized. The women of the town, and this was not all of them, but enough of them, the ones with time and inclination and a certain talent for group sentiment, had formed a view that they shared with remarkable efficiency across back fences and the dry goods counter and the pew bench before Sunday service. The view was this: that Nathaniel Brooks had sent for a mail-order bride and gotten something other than what he'd intended, and that this was somehow embarrassing for everyone involved, and that the woman's obvious confidence was not a virtue but a warning sign, and that the frontier was no place for someone who thought she could waltz in from Pennsylvania and start asking questions about loan documents. The voice that sharpened this view most effectively belonged to a woman named Clara Whitmore, who was Edmund Vale's sister-in-law, and had inherited, along with her husband's moderate prosperity and her own considerable social ambition, a talent for making her opinions feel like community consensus. Clara was not cruel in the obvious way. She was cruel in the particular way of a person who had learned to disguise dislike as concern. "I'm just saying," Clara said, in the dry goods store on the Wednesday of Eliza's first week, while Eliza was 3 feet away, examining a bolt of muslin that she needed for curtains in the bunkhouse, because the bunkhouse had no curtains, and she'd decided that men who slept in a dark box with no curtains were men who felt like the dark box. Was all they deserved, and she intended to correct that I'm just saying that Nathaniel deserves someone who fits this life, not someone who well. A pause calibrated to let well carry its full weight. Not everyone is suited. Eliza didn't look up from the muslin. The woman behind the counter, Alice, who ran the store with her husband and had her own views about Clara Whitmore, made a small sound that could have been agreement or the beginning of a cough. She's right there, Clara, someone whispered. I know she is, Clara said at the same volume. Eliza set the muslin down, turned to the counter, and asked Alice the price per yard. Alice told her. Eliza said she'd take 6 yards and asked if Alice could add it to the Brooks account. Alice said yes and began measuring. Clara waited for some response to her comment. Some flinch, some tight-jawed silence that would indicate the wound had landed, some overcompensating friendliness that would indicate the same thing from the other direction. Eliza gave her none of it. She took her muslin, thanked Alice, and walked out. Clara watched her go. Something in Clara's expression shifted, a tightening, almost imperceptible, the reaction of a person who has thrown a stone at a wall and watched it bounce back without effect. She didn't like it. She filed it. And the next time she spoke to her brother-in-law about Brooks Ranch, she included this detail, small and sharp, in her report. What Edmund Vale understood about women like Eliza, or believed he understood, which in his case had usually amounted to the same thing, was that they had a category. The confident ones, the competent ones, the ones who arrived somewhere and started reorganizing it. They were interesting for a limited period, and then they ran into something they couldn't reorganize, and then the confidence became brittleness, and then they broke or they left. He had seen it enough times to believe it was a law. He was 54 years old, had been in Red Hollow for 18 of those years, and had built his position through a combination of genuine commercial instinct and a careful selection of which rules he followed and which ones he simply rewrote in his own favor. He owned, directly or through paper companies, controlling interests in the supply depot, a quarter of the residential lots in town, the feed company, 2 cattle operations, and the land company that held Nathaniel Brooks's loan. He did not think of himself as a villain. He thought of himself as a man who understood how value actually worked, as opposed to how people liked to believe it worked, and who had acted on that understanding while others chose comfortable myths. He heard about Eliza's arrival the same day it happened. He heard about the dinner. Clem had a brother in town who talked. He heard by the end of her first week that she'd been asking questions about supply accounts and had spent 2 evenings in the land office's public records room, which anyone could access, and which Eliza had been accessing with a thoroughness that the records clerk found slightly alarming. He did not panic. He did not feel threatened. He felt the early stage of something he recognized as mild irritation, which was what he felt when something small required attention before it became something larger. He sent a note to Territorial Provisions, the supply company that held the Brooks feed contract. The note said to hold all deliveries pending payment of the outstanding balance in full in advance. This was not standard. This was not technically within the legal terms of the contract. But Edmund knew that by the time anyone filed the right paperwork to challenge it, the winter feeding season would be half over, and the cattle would be in trouble, and Nathaniel would be desperate enough to accept any restructured terms Vale chose to offer. He did not think about Eliza's reaction to this. She was, in his assessment, not yet relevant enough to anticipate. That was his first miscalculation. The note from Territorial Provisions arrived at Brooks Ranch on a Thursday, delivered by a rider who left it at the gate and did not wait for a response. Nathaniel read it at the kitchen table, and Eliza watched his face go through 3 distinct stages: confusion, then understanding, then a controlled blankness that she recognized as the expression of a person trying not to let fear show. They're calling the balance due up front, he said. All of it. Before they'll deliver next month's feed. Eliza held out her hand. He gave her the note. She read it. This isn't standard terms, she said. No. But they can't. They can't, she said. Not legally, not if the contract says otherwise. Do you have the original supply contract? Somewhere. I'd have to find it. Find it tonight. She set the note on the table between them. This is pressure. It's designed to make you panic and agree to something you shouldn't agree to. As long as you don't respond before we know what your contract actually says, they have no leverage. He looked at her. If they don't deliver the feed, then we source feed from somewhere else. There are other suppliers. They may cost more in the short term. She said it like she'd already thought 3 steps ahead, which she had. And I've been writing letters. To who? To suppliers in Laramie and Cheyenne. Feed operations that aren't connected to Vale. I haven't sent them yet because I wasn't sure we needed to. Now I'm sure. She looked at him steadily. This isn't a disaster, Nathaniel. It's an escalation. He's escalating because we've been looking at the right things, and he's noticed. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the horses made a sound from the corral, and the wind answered it. You keep saying we, he said. She looked at him, and for a moment her expression was the most unguarded it had been since she'd arrived, not soft. Exactly, but honest. I haven't decided yet whether to stay past the trial period, she said. You made it clear in your letters that was an option. I haven't decided. But right now I'm here, and right now this is my problem too. And I don't see the value in pretending otherwise until I've decided. It was the most direct thing she'd said about her own uncertainty, which had been real from the beginning. She was not a woman who pretended to be certain when she wasn't. She had come west because her options were real, and the letter was honest, and the man seemed decent. She had not come west because she had no doubts. Nathaniel nodded. Find the supply contract, he said. Not a question this time. I'll find it, she said. And then I'm going to write those letters. We'll have quotes by the end of the month. He nodded again. And then after a beat, the bunkhouse curtains looked good. She almost smiled, not quite, but almost. The light in there was terrible, she said. The men noticed, he said. They didn't say anything, but they noticed. She looked down at the note from Territorial Provisions, folded it, and put it in the pocket of her apron. Evidence. Everything was evidence, if you were paying attention. Tomorrow morning, she said, I want to talk to Clem about the fence line on the east pasture, and I want to know exactly who delivered this note and which direction they rode off. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the table between them cast a yellow light across the ledgers and papers that had become the shared language of the past week. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved through the yard with its permanent, patient insistence. East, he said. He rode east back toward town. Toward town, she said quietly. Good. She got up and went to find the supply contract, and Nathaniel sat at the table in the yellow lamplight and thought that whatever happened next with the loan, with the missing cattle, with Edmund Vale and his supply company, and his balloon claws and his sister-in-law, and her careful cruelties, whatever happened next, was going to be different from anything that had happened on this ranch in the last 3 years. Because nothing that was happening on this ranch right now was happening the same way it had before. Something had changed the morning a woman stepped off the stage in Red Hollow with one bag and steady eyes. He wasn't sure yet where it was going, but for the first time in 3 years he wanted to find out. The supply contract was in the third place. Nathaniel looked a leather folder wedged between two heavier ledgers on the shelf above the desk. The kind of place where things ended up when they were important enough to keep, but not urgent enough to organize properly. He brought it to the table at 9 o'clock that night and set it in front of Eliza without a word. She read it twice. The first time through quickly, establishing the shape of it. The second time slowly, the way she'd learned to read legal language which was not her native territory, but had become familiar through necessity, through years of dealing with mill contracts and tenant agreements on her father's behalf, when her father's eyes had gotten too bad for close print. The delivery terms were on page 3. She read the relevant clause, set the document down, and looked at Nathaniel. They can't do what they're doing, she said. The contract specifies 30 days written notice before any change in payment terms. They sent a note with a rider. That's not written notice. That's not 30 days. They may not care whether it's legal, Nathaniel said. He had his hands around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from. Vale doesn't usually need to be legal. He just needs to be first. First doesn't work if we move faster, she said. She slid the contract toward him. I need you to write a response to Territorial Provisions tonight. Not angry. Just precise. You're acknowledging receipt of their communication. You're noting that it does not comply with the terms of the original agreement, and you're informing them that you expect delivery on the contracted schedule. Keep it short, keep it formal. And if they ignore it, then we have documentation that they violated the terms, which matters later. She stood up. I'm going to finish writing those letters to the Laramie suppliers. We need to move on both tracks, hold them to the contract while building an alternative. Nathaniel looked at the contract in his hand. He was a man who had always understood land better than paper, who could read weather and cattle and soil with the ease of long practice, but who still felt something close to vertigo when confronted with legal language designed to be understood only by people who already understood it. That vertigo was part of how he'd ended up in this situation. He knew that. I'm not good at this, he said. Not an apology. Just a fact. Nobody is the first time through, Eliza said. Write the letter. I'll look at it before you send it. He wrote it. She looked at it, suggested 2 changes, both small, and he rewrote those sections without argument because the changes were better, and he could see that they were better. They were at the table until past 11, which was late by ranch standards, where the workday started before light and the body began shutting down by 8. Neither of them mentioned this. The lamp burned between them, And outside the Wyoming, dark pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the bunkhouse, one of the hands was snoring loud enough to hear through two walls. "How did you know?" Nathaniel said finally. Not quite as a question. "To look at the supply accounts first?" She considered the question honestly, the way she considered most things. "Because the loan is the obvious problem," she said. "And the obvious problem is rarely the only problem. When someone structures a situation to create one crisis, they usually create smaller pressures around it. It keeps the person in trouble, looking the wrong direction." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "You talk about it like you've seen it before." "Not exactly this, but versions of it," she paused. "There was a man in our county at home who did something similar with mill workers. Extended credit at the company store at high rates, then tightened the credit terms when workers tried to organize. Same principle. Make the small pain loud enough that nobody looks at the structure behind it." "What happened to him?" "He sold out and moved to Pittsburgh eventually. But not before he'd done a lot of damage." She said it without bitterness. "Just reporting. The men who challenged him lost most of the time, but they documented everything, and when it finally mattered, the documentation existed." "Is that what we're doing, documenting?" "Among other things," she said. The letter went to territorial provisions the next morning, carried by Pete, who had been given careful instructions about getting a signature confirming receipt. Eliza's letters to the Laramie suppliers went out the same day, along with a separate letter to the county recorder's office requesting the ownership records for territorial provisions which were public record, available to anyone who asked, and which she suspected very few people had ever thought to request. She did not tell Nathaniel about the letter to the recorder's office, not because she was hiding it, but because she wasn't yet certain it would produce anything useful, and she'd learned years ago that it was better to surface information when it was confirmed rather than when it was suspected. Suspected information made people anxious in ways that weren't always productive. She had enough to manage without adding anxiety to the list. The ranch work continued the way it always continued: the feeding, the fence checks, the daily maintenance of animals and equipment that formed the unceasing rhythm of any working cattle operation. Eliza had not come to replace any of that. She had no intention of pretending to be a ranch hand, but she inserted herself into the knowledge of it systematically, spending time with Clem each morning, asking questions that were practical rather than ceremonial, learning the specific geography of the Brooks Range, which pastures were good, which were overgrazed, where the fencing was weakest, which cattle were in what condition. Clem, who had been prepared to be neutral about this woman, and then wait to see which direction neutral should eventually lean, found himself answering her questions with increasing detail, because she asked the right questions, which was something he respected more than almost anything else. A person who asked the right questions had been paying attention, and a person who had been paying attention was a person worth talking to. "The east pasture fence," she said on the fourth morning, walking beside him, while he checked the line. "When did it last get a full repair?" "Year before last. Nathaniel and me did most of it ourselves." "And the section near the creek crossing?" Clem slowed slightly. He glanced at her sideways. "Why do you ask about that section particular?" "Because in the calving records there's a gap of 11 animals, and the gaps seem to cluster in the spring seasons, which is when cattle stray toward water in dry years. If the fence near the creek crossing was weak, animals could cross out of the range and not come back." She said it neutrally. "Or they could be moved out through a weak section deliberately." Clem was quiet for a moment. He was a man who thought before he spoke, which Eliza had already identified as one of his best qualities. "The crossing section needed work last spring," he said finally. "I brought it up to Nathaniel. We were short on wire at the time." "Did you order wire?" "I put it on the supply order. Whether it came." He stopped. "Whether it came," she repeated, and they both understood what they were not quite saying. She walked the creek crossing section herself that afternoon. The fence there had been repaired recently, she thought, the wire newer than the posts, which meant someone had done it after the fact. But the ground on both sides showed the compressed, churned pattern of cattle moving through a gap repeatedly over time. Not straying, moving. The pattern was too regular, too channeled, for animals that had simply wandered. She stood at the crossing for a long time, looking at the ground and the creek and the land on the other side that was not part of Brooks Range but abutted it, belonging to a smaller operation, whose name she'd seen on the county land maps without yet knowing anything about its ownership. She pulled out the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket and wrote down 3 things: the name on the land map, the condition of the fence posts, and the date. Then she walked back to the house. The response from Territorial Provisions came 8 days later. It was not the response either of them had expected. It didn't contest Eliza's reading of the contract terms. It didn't threaten further action. It was brief and almost aggressively bureaucratic, acknowledging her letter and confirming that delivery would continue on the contracted schedule. Nathaniel read it twice and handed it to her. They backed down? They stepped back, she said. There was a difference, and her expression said she knew the difference. This doesn't end it. It just means they've moved to a different approach. She folded the letter. The balloon clause on the loan hasn't gone anywhere. That's still the real weapon. How long? At your current payment rate, the balance due at the balloon date is. She'd done the calculation 3 times because she wanted to be certain. More than you have in operating reserves, considerably more. He already knew this. Hearing it stated plainly did not make it easier. What are the options, he said. 3 that I can see. 1, refinance through a legitimate bank before the balloon date. That requires approaching banks in Laramie or Cheyenne, which I've already drafted letters for, pending your review. 2, raise enough operating revenue in the next 60 days to cover a significant portion of the balance, which is possible but requires decisions about which cattle to sell and when, and means accepting lower prices at a late-season market. 3, challenge the legality of the balloons itself, which is a longer process and may not resolve before the due date, but creates leverage if Vail tries to foreclose. Nathaniel looked at her. All 3. That's what I'd recommend, she said. Not because any one of them is certain, but because if one fails, you need the others already in motion. He nodded slowly. He was not a man who liked complexity. He liked problems with clear physical solutions: a broken fence, a sick animal, a water supply that needed rerouting. He had never been comfortable with the kind of problem that lived in paper and had 12 contingencies. But he was learning in these past 2 weeks that not liking a thing and being unable to do it were different conditions, and that the second didn't have to follow from the first. I'll look at the bank letters tonight, he said. There's one more thing, Eliza said. She set a second piece of paper on the table. It was a copy she'd made of the county recorder's response to her ownership inquiry. Territorial provisions. The registered owner is a company called Red Hollow Land and Livestock Management, Incorporated. The principal of that company is listed as Edmund Vail, Nathaniel said. Edmund Vail, she confirmed. The room was very quiet. He's been supplying his own pressure, Nathaniel said. The loan and the feed contract, both of them. And the property on the other side of your East Creek crossing, she said. That's registered to a subsidiary of the same company, which is relevant given what I found at the fence line. She told him what she'd found: the ground patterns, the churned earth, the newer wire on older posts. She told him what she thought it meant, carefully, not as accusation but as interpretation of physical evidence. When she finished, Nathaniel was very still in the particular way of a man who has been given information that reorganizes a significant portion of his recent past. He was thinking about the 11 missing animals, about the spring seasons, about the supply order for wire that Clem had requested and that had apparently not arrived. He's been taking my cattle, he said. I think so, she said. I think the fence was maintained weak, deliberately. Animals were moved through it at night or in early morning, and they were absorbed into the adjacent operation, where they're impossible to identify individually. Cattle don't carry documentation. That's theft. Yes, that's criminal. Yes, she said again, which is different from the loan situation. The loan is civil. This is potentially criminal. But proving it requires more than ground patterns and a gap in the calving records. What does it require? She looked at him steadily. A witness. Or a paper trail connecting the adjacent operation's headcount increases to your calving gaps. Or both. He stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his hands on the sill, looking out at the ranch that had been bleeding in ways he hadn't been able to see. The sun was going down behind the western hills, that particular Wyoming sunset that turned everything briefly and violently gold before the dark came. He thought about 3 years. He thought about the 2 hands who'd left for other work. He thought about the crackers and salt pork and the single coffee pot and the kitchen that had become a room for surviving instead of living. He thought about all of it, and he thought about Edmund Vail in a warm office somewhere in town, managing it all from a distance, and something moved through him that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite shame at having been played this way, but had elements of all 3, and was worse for the combination. What do we do? He said. His voice was flat and controlled. We keep moving on all 3 tracks, she said, and we find the witness. The witness found them first, in a manner of speaking. His name was Roy Hatch, and he had worked for the adjacent operation, the one registered to Vail's subsidiary, for 14 months, before deciding he wanted no further part of it. He was 41 years old, slight, with the permanent squint of a man who'd spent too many years in bright sun, and he came to the front door of Brooks Ranch on a gray October morning with his hat in both hands and an expression that was some specific combination of nervousness and tired-out determination. Clem saw him coming up the approach road and told Eliza before Roy had even reached the porch. Eliza told Clem to let him come to the door and to stay nearby. She answered the knock herself. Roy looked at her. He'd heard about the woman at Brooks Ranch. Everyone in a 20-mile radius had heard about the woman at Brooks Ranch by this point. But what he'd heard hadn't prepared him for the directness of her attention, which was the kind that made a person feel immediately that lying would be a waste of both parties' time. "Ma'am," he said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm looking for Mr. Brooks. He's in the south pasture," she said. "I can get him if you need him specifically. But whatever you need to say to him, you can say to me first, and it'll get to him accurately." She paused. "You want to come in?" He came in. She sat him at the kitchen table and gave him coffee, which was the same thing she'd learned to do in every situation where a person needed time to organize themselves before speaking. Coffee gave a person something to do with their hands and a reason to be sitting down, and sitting down was important when someone was carrying something. Roy wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table. "I worked for the Creekside operation," he said, "east of you." "I know the property," she said. "I know what's been happening," he said. "With the cattle." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard the way it always did. "Tell me," she said. And something in how she said it, not excited, not aggressive, just present and ready, made Roy Hatch look up from the coffee cup and meet her eyes. He talked for 40 minutes. He was not a natural talker, not a storyteller, not someone who organized information for effect. He was a man who had worked a job, seen things he knew were wrong, left the job, and was now saying what he'd seen in the order he'd seen it, which was not always linear and required some navigation. But the substance was there, and Eliza let him get to all of it without rushing him or steering him. Because steering a witness was how you introduced the possibility that the story was yours instead of theirs. The cattle had been moved at night, twice in the spring and once in late summer through the creek crossing section. Not many at a time, 6 or 8 animals, moved carefully to avoid noise. Roy had been told they were strays that had wandered onto Creekside property and that they were being absorbed into the herd for operational reasons. He'd been told not to ask further questions. He'd asked anyway, eventually, because he was the kind of man who had trouble pretending not to see things, and he'd been let go 2 weeks ago with a final pay envelope and a clear implication about what would happen to people who talked too much. "I'm not interested in being the kind of man who lets that ride," Roy said. He said it looking at the table, which was where people often looked when they were saying something true about themselves that cost them something. "I got no proof beyond what I saw, but I saw it. Your testimony is proof," Eliza said. "That's what testimony is." He looked up. "It's my word. Sworn and documented, it's evidence." She turned her coffee cup. "Are you willing to put it in writing? In front of a notary or a justice of the peace?" He thought about it. She could see him thinking about it, the weight of it, the consequences, the specific fear of a man who has no particular resources to fall back on if he makes an enemy of Edmund Vale. She did not minimize it. She did not tell him it would be fine, or that Vale couldn't touch him, or any of the comfortable reassurances that were not hers to promise. "It's not without risk," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know it's not," he said, "but it matters. Specifically for the cattle situation, which is criminal rather than civil. And it may matter for other people in the same position." Roy turned his hat in his hands again. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you going to actually do something with it? Or is this going to be one of those situations where somebody takes a statement and it goes into a drawer somewhere, and the man with the money wins anyway?" It was a fair question. It was, in fact, the most important question anyone had asked her since she'd arrived, because it cut straight to the things she'd been turning over in her own mind for weeks, whether the approach she was taking, the careful documentation, the legal language, the traceable paper trails, whether any of it would actually work against a man who had been building his position for 2 decades. "I don't know," she said. "I can tell you what I'm doing and what I think it can accomplish. I can't promise outcomes I don't control." She paused. "But I'll tell you this, I don't take statements to put them in drawers. That's not why I'm doing any of this." Roy looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said, "where do I sign?" Nathaniel came back from the south pasture at noon to find Roy Hatch sitting at his kitchen table, signing a 6 sworn statement that Eliza had written out in a clear, careful hand while Roy talked and she listened. She introduced the 2 men and explained, briefly and without drama, what Roy had said. Nathaniel sat down heavily in the chair across from Roy. He looked at the statement. He looked at Roy. He looked like a man trying to hold several very large things in his mind at once and finding that his mind, while not small, was at capacity. "You left Creekside because of this?" he said to Roy. "I left because I don't do that kind of work," Roy said. "I've done a lot of things in my life. That's not one of them." Nathaniel was quiet. Then he said, "You need work?" Roy blinked. "I what? Do you need work, employment?" "I've got 4 men and could use a 5th, and you know cattle." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things. "I can't pay what Vale probably paid you, but it's honest." Roy looked from Nathaniel to Eliza as if checking whether this was real. Eliza's expression was neutral in the way that meant she thought it was a reasonable idea, but wasn't going to say so out loud because it wasn't her decision. I'd have to think on it, Roy said. Think on it, Nathaniel said. The offer's there. After Roy left with a copy of his statement and directions to the justice of the peace in the sex town who Eliza had already determined was not part of Vale's network, Nathaniel and Eliza sat at the kitchen table in the particular quiet that followed something significant. The bank letters, he said eventually. Did you finalize them? Last night, she said. They're ready when you are. Send both cities? All of them, he said. Every bank on the list, she nodded. He looked at the table where Roy's coffee cup still sat. He's going to come back at us harder when he finds out we have a witness. Yes, she said. You're ready for that? She considered the question honestly, because it deserved an honest answer and not a reassuring one. I don't think ready is exactly the right word, she said. But I know what we're doing and why we're doing it, and that's usually enough to keep moving when things get harder. He looked at her. Across the table, in the kitchen that had stopped being a room for surviving and had become a room where actual decisions got made, he looked at her and thought about the 40 days she'd been here, and all the distance that 40 days had covered, and he thought that whatever was developing between them, the thing neither of them had named yet, the thing that was visible in the particular quality of their silences, and the way they'd begun to anticipate each other's thinking, was something that neither of them had planned for, and both of them were, in their different ways, uncertain how to hold. He didn't say any of that. He said, I'll take the bank letters to town tomorrow. I'll have them sealed tonight, she said. What neither of them knew, sitting at that table in the October afternoon, was that by the time those letters reached the banks in Laramie and Cheyenne, Edmund Vale would already know about Roy Hatch's visit to Brooks Ranch, would already know about the sworn statement, would already have decided that the woman he'd dismissed as a temporary inconvenience had become something that required his direct attention. Edmund Vale had built 20 years of control through patience and precision. He had moved slowly, methodically, without heat. He moved differently when he was threatened. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt threatened. Clara Whitmore came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unexpected enough that Clem came and found Eliza in the kitchen garden she was turning over the soil for the winter, a thing that needed doing, and that she'd been putting off to tell her there was a woman at the door in town clothes. Eliza came around the house and found Clara standing on the porch, dressed in what passed for a formal call in red hollow, a gray wool coat, gloves, her hair precisely arranged. She looked at Eliza coming around from the back of the house, with dirt on her apron, and her sleeves rolled up and produced the kind of small, controlled expression that said she had expected exactly this and found it consistent with her existing view. Mrs. Whitmore, Eliza said. She didn't particularly inflect it. Miss Hartwell. Clara looked at the state of her. I hope I'm not interrupting. I was gardening, Eliza said. Come in. She did not change her apron or roll down her sleeves. She poured coffee. Clara accepted a cup with the manner of someone performing politeness rather than feeling it, and they sat in the front room, which was still sparse but no longer had the stripped quality it had carried when Eliza arrived. Clara's gaze moved around the room in the way that made clear she was taking inventory. You've made changes, she said. Some, Eliza said. The ranch seems to be operating better, Clara said. I've heard that. I hope so, Eliza said. She waited. There was something underneath this visit that hadn't arrived yet, and she'd learned not to spend energy filling space while she waited for it. I wanted to speak to you woman to woman, Clara said. And there it was, the specific phrasing that, in Eliza's experience, preceded advice that was really a warning wearing the costume of concern. This situation with Edmund, my brother-in-law, you need to understand who you're dealing with. Tell me, Eliza said. Clara was briefly surprised by this. She'd expected resistance or denial or some version of defiance. Plain attention was not what she'd prepared for. Edmund has been part of this community for a very long time, she said. He's built a great deal here. Businesses, employment, the supply infrastructure that most ranches in this county depend on. He is not, she stopped, assembled herself. He is not someone who loses gracefully. And he is not someone who can be outmaneuvered by a woman who's been here 40 days. I appreciate the information, Eliza said. Clara looked at her with something that had moved past dislike into something more complicated. She had come here with a message: get out. Essentially, leave the loan situation to men who understood it. Stop making Vale uncomfortable, but the message required the recipient to be persuadable, and she was sitting across from a woman who received information, like a person receiving weather reports. Present, paying attention, not moved. He will make this very hard, Clara said. For Nathaniel most of all. Yes, Eliza said. I think that's already the plan. Clara set her coffee cup down. I'm trying to help you. I know you think you are, Eliza said. It was not cruel. It was precise. But what you're actually doing is delivering a message for someone who'd rather not deliver it himself. And the message is that I should be frightened enough to stop. I'm not frightened enough to stop. So the message doesn't accomplish what it was meant to. Clara's composure held. It was well-trained composure, capable of handling most things. But something in her eyes shifted, not retreat exactly, but recalibration. She was looking at Eliza differently. You're very certain of yourself, Clara said. No, Eliza said, I'm not. But I'm certain of what I'm doing and why it's right. That's different, Clara stood. She smoothed her coat, picked up her gloves. She looked like she was going to say something final and cutting. And then she looked at Eliza again, and apparently decided it would land like everything else she'd said received without flinching, and decided instead on silence. She left. Eliza watched her go from the porch, then went back to the kitchen garden and kept turning soil until the light got too thin, because the ground needed it and because there was no value in standing still when something needed doing. Later that evening, she told Nathaniel about the visit. She told it factually, without dramatizing it. He was quiet for a while after she finished. Then he said, she came here to scare you off, yes. And the soil's turned in the kitchen garden, she said. We'll have better spring planting. He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. And for a moment the weight of the balloon claws and the missing cattle and Edmund Vale and his 20 years of accumulated control lifted slightly, just enough to breathe, just enough to remember that whatever was bearing down on them had not arrived yet and would not arrive this particular evening. And this particular evening the kitchen was warm, and the accounts were moving in the right direction, and there was a woman across this table who had turned up with one bag and was still here. That was not nothing. In a 3-year run of nothing, it was very much not nothing. Outside, the Wyoming dark settled in for the night, patient and enormous the way it always was. Inside, the lamp burned on. The work continued. Roy Hatch started work at Brooks Ranch on a Wednesday, which was not a ceremonial day or a significant one. It was simply the Wednesday after Nathaniel made the offer, and Roy thought about it for 4 days, and came back with his gear in a single saddlebag, and an expression that said he had made his decision and was not going to second-guess it out loud. Clem showed him the bunkhouse and which peg was available, and where the extra blankets were kept, and that was the entirety of Roy's welcome, which suited Roy perfectly, because he was not a man who needed ceremony. What Roy brought with him beyond the sworn statement was knowledge of the adjacent property's operation that proved in the following days more detailed than Eliza had hoped. He knew the head count. He knew the branding practices. He knew that in the past 18 months, approximately 23 animals had been moved through that creek crossing and absorbed into the creekside herd, not 11, as the calving records had suggested, but 23, because the records Eliza had access to were incomplete and the actual gap was worse than the paper showed. He told her this on his 3rd evening at the ranch, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, when Nathaniel and Clem had gone out to deal with a water trough that was running slow. He told it quietly, with the particular manner of a man recounting something that had been sitting badly in him for a long time, and was only now finding a way out. Eliza wrote it down. All of it. The dates Roy could remember, the approximate animal counts per incident, the names of the 2 men who had done the actual moving hands from the creekside operation, neither of them named Vale, both of them presumably following instructions from someone they couldn't afford to refuse. She wrote it in the same careful, numbered format she'd been using for all the documentation, the kind of format that would read cleanly in a legal context. The 2 men who moved the cattle, she said. Do you know where they are now? One's still at Creekside, far as I know. The other one left in August. I heard he went to Colorado. The one's still at Creekside, she said. Would he talk? Roy's expression said he thought that was unlikely. He's got a family. Wife, 3 children. Vale owns the house they're living in. He paused. That's how it works out there. You don't just work for the man, you live in something he owns, and you buy from a store he controls. And by the time you've been there a year, you're so folded into it that walking away means starting with nothing. Eliza was quiet, absorbing this. It was not a new architecture. She'd seen versions of it in the mill towns of Pennsylvania. The way a large operator could make himself structurally inescapable for the people who depended on him. The genius of it, if you could call it that, was that it didn't require threats. It just required making the cost of refusal high enough that most people calculated it wasn't worth it. All right, she said. We work with what we have. What they had was Roy's statement, the physical evidence at the creek crossing, the ownership records linking territorial provisions and the creekside operation to Vale's corporate structure, and a steadily clarifying picture of how the whole mechanism had been assembled. It was more than she'd had 3 weeks ago. It was not yet enough for what she was building toward, but it was moving in the right direction. And in her experience, the key to this kind of work was not waiting until you had everything before you moved. It was building while you moved, because the alternative was standing still while the other side kept operating. The responses from the Laramie and Cheyenne banks came in over the following week. 2 rejections, which were not surprising. Bank rejections rarely gave their real reasons. Eliza read both letters carefully and thought she recognized the particular phrasing of institutions that had been spoken to by someone with influence before the application arrived. 1 conditional expression of interest, which was something. 1 genuine inquiry requesting additional documentation, which was more than something. That one came from a bank in Cheyenne, a medium-sized institution whose principal had written a personal note at the bottom of the formal letter in a handwriting that was slanted and slightly impatient, saying simply, "The situation you describe is not unfamiliar to this office. We would like to discuss further." Eliza read that note 4 times. She showed it to Nathaniel that evening. He read it, set it down. He knows what's happening. He recognizes the pattern, she said, which means he's seen it before, which means Vail has done versions of this to other ranches, and some of them have ended up looking for refinancing. She tapped the letter. That's useful. Not just for us. How soon can we get to Cheyenne? I want to write back first. Establish what we're bringing, what the documentation looks like, what we need. She folded the letter carefully. If we go in there unprepared, we waste the opportunity. If we go in with the full picture organized and legible, we're a different kind of conversation. He looked at her. There was something he'd been wanting to say for several days, something that had been accumulating in the particular way, that things accumulate in a person who does not talk easily about the things that matter most to him. He'd been watching her work the letters, the records, the conversations with Roy, the careful documentation of everything, the way she approached each problem like it was a structure to be understood rather than a crisis to be survived, and the watching had become something he didn't know the right word for. Not admiration exactly, though that was part of it. Something more specific, something that had to do with the fact that she had come here for her own reasons, uncertain about all of it, not owing him anything beyond a fair attempt, and had given considerably more than a fair attempt without making that fact into a performance. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. She looked at him. I know. I mean the way you've approached it. You could have. He stopped, searching for language that was accurate without being awkward. You could have done the household things and left the ranch business to me. That would have been a waste, she said, not defensive, just factual. That's what most people would have done. I'm not most people, she said. She said it without vanity, the same way she said most things as a simple observation about a factual situation. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm glad you came. It was not a grand declaration. It was a man saying a plain, true thing, and she received it the same way. She received most things steadily, without performance. I'm not unglad, she said, which was honest, because she wasn't certain enough in her own feelings to say more than that, and she'd learned the hard way that certainty about feelings that hadn't fully formed yet was how people ended up in situations they hadn't chosen. He didn't push it. That was one of the things she was coming to understand about Nathaniel Brooks. He didn't push. He stated things when he needed to state them and then left room. It was a quality she had not encountered in abundance. Edmund Vail heard about the Cheyenne Bank inquiry on a Thursday, through the particular grapevine that he had cultivated over 2 decades, with the patient attentiveness of a man who understood that information was infrastructure. He had contacts in 3 county offices, 2 town councils, the Laramie Telegraph Office, and less formally a relationship with a clerk at the Cheyenne Bank, in question who owed him a financial favor and had been discreet about repaying it until now. He sat in his office above the Red Hollow Supply Depot and read the note that described the inquiry. He read it once, set it down, picked it up again and read the part about the bank principal's handwritten addendum, which his contact had reproduced from memory and which Vail recognized immediately for what it was, an invitation. He had assumed the letters would go to banks. He had assumed they would mostly be rejected because he had done the groundwork on that front, as a matter of course. What he had not assumed was that the Cheyenne Bank in particular would respond with anything beyond a polite form rejection. Because the principal there, a man named Garrett, who Vail had met twice and assessed as cautious rather than principled, which was a meaningful difference, was not the type he'd have predicted to wade into a situation like this. Apparently, he'd misjudged Garrett. He did not like misjudging people. He folded the note and put it in his desk drawer and sat for several minutes looking at the wall of his office, which was hung with a map of the county showing land parcels, many of them marked in a way that indicated his interest or ownership. He had spent 18 years building that map from an empty wall. He knew every parcel, every owner, every debt arrangement, every vulnerability. It was the most detailed picture of this county's economic structure that existed anywhere, and it lived in his head as much as on the wall, and it was what allowed him to operate the way he operated. He thought about Eliza Hartwell. He thought about the woman he'd dismissed in his own thinking. privately as temporary, a mail-order bride with opinions, an Easterner who would eventually encounter the frontier's reality and revise her ambitions accordingly. He had given that process roughly 3 months to complete itself. She had not revised. She had accelerated. He stood up and went to the window. Below, the main street of Red Hollow moved through its ordinary midday activity. Wagons and horses, and the particular social choreography of a small town that knew most of its own business. He had built this, not all of it, not solely, but substantially. The supply depot, the feed company, the credit structures that kept smaller operations viable when they would otherwise have failed, keeping them viable in a particular way that also kept them obligated. He had always thought of this as practical. He had always thought of the people who'd benefited from his structures as people who had needed what he provided. He was aware, on some level, that this was not how they thought of it. He pulled his coat from the stand by the door. He had a visit to make. He came to the ranch directly, which was not what Eliza had expected. She had expected continued pressure through proxies, more supply disruptions, more financial maneuvering, perhaps sass action through the town council, where he had 2 reliable votes. She had not expected him to come himself, in his own buggy, on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the low, flat gray of incoming weather, and Nathaniel was in the north pasture with Clem and Pete. She was in the yard when he arrived, helping Roy repair a section of the fence near the barn, not the creek crossing fence, which was now properly documented, and which she had made a deliberate decision to leave visibly repaired rather than disturbed, because evidence needed to remain legible but a different section, a simple maintenance task that needed doing. She saw the buggy come up the approach road and recognized Edmund Vale from the description Nathaniel had given her. Tall, heavy through the shoulders, a face that had learned to be pleasant without being warm. He drove well, which told her something about how long he'd been in this country. He brought the buggy to a stop in the yard and got down without hurrying. Roy had gone very still beside her. She felt this without looking at him. "Keep working," she said quietly. To Roy, he kept working, but his hands were not entirely steady. Vale walked toward her with his hat in his hand, which was a calculated gesture of courtesy that she recognized as performance rather than instinct. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I hope I'm not calling it a bad time." "I'm working," she said, "but I can take a few minutes." He looked at Roy with the particular quality of a man who is noting something and filing it. Roy did not look back. Perhaps inside, Vale said. "We can talk here," Eliza said. She set down the hammer she'd been holding and looked at him. "What can I do for you?" He looked at her steadily. He was reassessing. In real time, she could see that running the information he'd received against the actual person in front of him and finding the two didn't quite match. The woman he'd imagined from the reports was aggressive, confrontational. The woman in front of him was simply present. There was a difference, and he was smart enough to recognize it, which meant he was also smart enough to know it required a different approach. "I came to talk about the situation with the Brooks loan," he said. "I think there may be room for an arrangement that's better for everyone." "What kind of arrangement?" "An extension of the balloon term," he said. "Another 12 months. The rate stays the same. The balance stops accruing additional penalty interest. It gives the ranch time to get on its feet properly." He said it like he was conferring a benefit, like he was being generous. Eliza looked at him for a moment. In exchange for what? He was briefly surprised by the directness of this. Most people in a debt situation heard the words extension and 12 months and experienced a relief that made them slow to ask about the structure underneath the offer. She had not been slow. "The ranch operates within a supply arrangement with territorial provisions for a 5-year term," he said. "Locked rate." "At what rate?" He named a figure. It was lower than what Nathaniel was currently paying, which was the design of it lower than the current inflated rate, still above true market, still feeding his operation, still keeping the ranch tied to his supply structure for 5 years, while the financial situation remained unresolved. "No," she said. He looked at her. "Miss Hartwell." "The answer is no," she said. "Not because the extension isn't useful. 12 months would be useful, but a 5-year supply lock at above market rates nets out against the extension cost within 8 months, and then we're in the same position plus a longer contract." She said it without heat. "It's not a better arrangement for everyone. It's a better arrangement for you, and a slightly different bad arrangement for the ranch." He was very still. "I appreciate you coming in person," she said. "I think that was meant to signal seriousness, and I take it that way. But I'd want any arrangement to address the original loan terms rather than extend them, and I'd want the supply contract to reflect actual market rates rather than territorial provisions preferred margins." "You've been looking into territorial provisions," he said. "Not a question. The ownership records are public," she said. The yard was quiet. The wind moved through it with the particular gray day quality that presaged real weather. Somewhere behind the barn a horse moved and resettled. Vale looked at her with an expression that had moved past reassessment into something more settled and more specific. He had come here expecting to make an offer to a woman who was out of options, and he was standing in a yard, talking to someone who had clearly identified his offer as a structured disadvantage before he'd finished describing it. "You're well prepared," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. "I try to be," she said. "Where does this end from your perspective?" She looked at him directly. "The loan gets refinanced at fair terms through a legitimate bank. The cattle situation gets addressed through the appropriate legal channels. The ranch operates independently of your supply structure." She said it plainly, without triumph. "That's what I'm working toward." He was quiet for a moment, a man with a poker face who had encountered a hand he hadn't expected. "The cattle situation," he said carefully. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you are," she said. "But I understand why you wouldn't say so." He put his hat back on. He looked at her one more time, the full assessment of a man who has been surprised and is trying to determine whether what he's dealing with is a problem or a crisis, and where on that spectrum the appropriate response lies. "Good day, Miss Hartwell," he said. "Good day, Mr. Vale," she said. She watched him get back into his buggy and drive back down the approach road toward Red Hollow, and she stood there until the buggy had gone far enough that she could only see the dust it raised against the gray sky. Then she turned to Roy. Roy was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "He's not going to let this sit," Roy said. "No," she said. "He's not." She picked up the hammer. "Hand me that nail." He did not let it sit. What he did instead was move on 3 fronts simultaneously, which was his natural mode of operation, when he felt a situation escalating past the point where single-vector pressure was sufficient. The first front was the town council. Red Hollow had a 5-member council, 2 of whom were reliably Vale's men who had benefited from his economic structures and knew it, and had long since made their peace with what that meant for their independence of judgment. A 3rd member was a rancher named Hobart, whose small operation had been struggling for 2 years and who was vulnerable to pressure of the financial kind. Vale did not approach Hobart directly. He had a conversation with Territorial Provisions account manager about the Hobart feed contract and the upcoming renewal, and the rest followed from that, without Vale having to say anything explicit that could be recalled later. The second front was the bank. Specifically, a letter from Vale's attorney to the Cheyenne Bank's principal, which did not threaten but which laid out, with considerable legal precision, the argument that the Brooks property was encumbered by obligations that made it unsuitable as collateral for refinancing, and which included several attached documents that were accurate in their individual facts, while creating a collectively misleading picture of the ranch's financial stability. It was the kind of letter that lawyers wrote for people who understood that truth was partly a matter of what you chose to include. The third front was the most direct, and it was the one that Eliza did not anticipate, which was the only one that genuinely surprised her, which was later something she thought about and recognized as the single place where she had miscalculated the shape of the threat. He went after Roy. Not physically, not in a way that was traceable, but Roy Hatch had a sister in Laramie, a woman named Dora, who ran a small boarding house, and the boarding house had a mortgage with a small credit institution that was through 2 layers of holding company connected to Vale's financial network. The mortgage renewal came up in November. The terms of the renewal that were offered to Dora Hatch were different from the terms she'd been expecting, in ways that would make the payment unmanageable on her current income. Roy found out through a letter from Dora, which arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning, and which he read alone at the bunkhouse table before breakfast. He came to find Eliza afterward. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the letter in his hand, and his face doing the work of a man who has been holding something difficult and is trying to decide whether to set it down or keep holding it. "Read this," he said. She read it. She set it on the table and was quiet for a moment. "He's going after your sister," she said. "The mortgage terms they're offering would put her under in 4 months," Roy said. "She can't make those payments. She doesn't have the income for it." He sat down heavily across from her. "This is because of me. Because I talked. This is because of Vale," she said. "Not because of you." That's a distinction that doesn't help Dora much. She didn't argue that, because it was true and arguing true things was a waste of time. She thought for a moment quickly, the way she'd been learning to think in this situation, not linearly, but in the branching pattern of someone tracking multiple moving parts simultaneously. "Who holds the mortgage currently?" "Some company in Laramie." The letter has the name. She looked at the letter again. The company name was Frontier Credit Associates, which she had not encountered before, but which she would. "Give me a day," she said, Eliza. He said her name for the first time. "If this is going to keep happening, my sister, other people I need to think about whether—" "I know," she said. "Give me a day before you decide anything." He left the letter with her and went to work, because there was always work. And work was what a person did when they were trying not to think about things they couldn't immediately solve. Eliza spent the morning writing 2 letters. The first was to an attorney in Laramie, whose name she had gotten from the county recorder's office, a woman named Frances Aldrich, who had, according to the clerk who'd helped Eliza with the public records, a particular professional reputation for taking cases that involved what the clerk had diplomatically called creative financial structures. The letter described the Dora Hatch mortgage situation in precise terms and asked whether Frances Aldrich's firm handled this type of matter. The second letter was to the Cheyenne Bank principal, Garrett. This one was longer. She described, in organized detail, the full picture she had assembled: the loan structure, the supply contract manipulation, the cattle theft, Roy's statement, the ownership connections between territorial provisions and the Creekside property, and Edmund Vale's various corporate entities. She described the letter that Vale's attorney had almost certainly sent to the bank, and what it was designed to accomplish, and why its individual factual accuracy obscured a materially misleading larger picture. And then she attached copies of every document she had. She wrote for 3 hours. When she finished, she read it back twice, cut 2 paragraphs that were more emotional than useful, added a final section laying out what refinancing would look like given the ranch's actual operating trajectory over the past 60 days, and sealed it. Nathaniel came in from the morning's work and found her at the table surrounded by papers and draft pages. He had learned by now not to ask whether something was wrong when she looked like this, because the answer was always yes, something is wrong, and I'm in the middle of addressing it. So he poured himself coffee and sat down and waited. She told him about Roy's sister. She told him about the letters. She told him about her read on what Vale was doing, which was expanding the pressure points beyond the ranch itself to the people connected to those challenging him, making the cost of opposition radiate outward, making Roy and others feel that their resistance had consequences for people they cared about, who had done nothing. Nathaniel's face was doing the controlled blankness she now recognized as his way of managing anger. He's going after Roy's family.
Yes.
Because Roy gave a statement. Yes, that's... He stopped. Found a better word than the one he'd almost used. That's a particular kind of man. It is, she said. It's also a mistake on his part, tactically. He looked at her. How is that a mistake? Because it escalates past what the situation required, she said. Up until now, he's been operating within systems: the loan, the supply contract, the bank letters. Those are pressures that can be applied and removed, and that keep the conflict contained. Going after Roy's sister is personal pressure. It's the kind of thing that makes people angry in ways that are less controllable. She set down her pen. He did it because he's frustrated. And people who are frustrated make mistakes they don't make when they're patient. Nathaniel thought about this, or he's not frustrated. Maybe he's just doing what he always does, and we're reading intent where there's just method. It was a good point. She considered it honestly. Maybe. But the direct visit coming here himself, that wasn't method. That was him wanting to see what he was dealing with, which means the reports he was getting weren't satisfying him. And a man who isn't satisfied with his information starts making moves that are about feeling in control rather than actually being in control. She paused. I could be wrong. But I don't think I am. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun, small and tentative, the kind that melted as fast as it landed, but was a notice that winter was coming with or without anyone's permission. What do you need from me? He said. She had asked herself the same question about herself many times in the past weeks. What she needed from herself had been mostly clear. What she needed from him was harder to articulate because it was less transactional than the rest of it. I need you to hold steady, she said. The bank in Cheyenne is our best path. If Garrett responds to my letter the way I think he will, we may have a real conversation there. But it's going to take time, and between now and then Vale is going to push on every edge he can find. She looked at him. I need you to not make any decisions out of desperation. If he offers another arrangement, or if the council does something, or if anything comes through the land office, talk to me first. I'm not going to do anything without talking to you, he said. Said it like it was already a settled fact, which she supposed it had become somewhere in the past weeks. Roy, she said, talk to him tonight. He needs to know we're not going to let his sister go under without a fight. He needs to know there's a lawyer looking at the mortgage. She paused. And he needs to know the decision about staying or going is his. I'm not going to tell him what he owes us. Nathaniel nodded. He got up and went to the window and looked out at the thin snow and the gray afternoon beyond it, the ranch that was slowly, unevenly, incompletely coming back to something that resembled what it should have been. The council meeting is next week, he said. I heard from Hobart that Vale has something he's planning to raise. Something about ranching operations and land use compliance. That'll be the fence situation, she said. Or a version of it. He'll try to use the council to create a compliance issue that gives him grounds to pressure the ranch through official channels. She thought for a moment. We need to go to that meeting. We, both of us, with documentation. She looked at him steadily. If he's going to use the council as a tool, then we need to be in the room when he uses it. He turned from the window. He had that expression again, the one she still hadn't found the right word for, the one that seemed to be equal parts something he respected and something he wasn't sure what to do with. You've been thinking about this a long time, he said. Since Clara Whitmore's visit, she said. The council was always going to be part of it. Men like Vale use every structure available. The council is a structure. She began organizing the papers into the folder she now kept for the ranch's legal documentation. We need supporters in that room, not just us. Who? Hobart, if I can get to him before Vale tightens the supply pressure. The Lund family, they have the dairy operation east of town, and I heard from Alice at the dry goods store that they've had their own supply issues with territorial provisions. She closed the folder. And Frances Aldrich, if she takes the Hatch case. A lawyer in the room changes the character of the meeting. Nathaniel looked at her. He had the specific expression of a man who is watching someone 3 moves ahead of him on a board. He's only just learning to play. It was not an uncomfortable feeling precisely. It was more like the feeling of being in unfamiliar territory with someone who knows the terrain. I'll talk to Hobart tomorrow, he said. He's not a bad man. He's just scared. Most people doing things they shouldn't are just scared, she said. That doesn't mean they can't be reached. She went to see the Lund family herself, 2 days before the council meeting, on a morning when the sky had cleared and the cold had settled properly in the way that meant business. She drove herself, which was a thing she could now do competently enough, though not gracefully, and which meant a 30-minute drive each way on roads that were beginning to firm with cold. The Lund operation was smaller than Brooks Ranch, and better maintained in some respects. The Lunds had 4 children, 3 of them old enough to work, and 4 pairs of hands make a material difference in what gets repaired and what gets left. Marta Lund, who ran the household and also, Eliza had learned, kept the books, and made most of the significant operational decisions, met her at the door with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was clearly still forming an opinion. Miss Hartwell, she said. I heard you were coming. Word travels, Eliza said. It does out here, Marta let her in. Coffee, it was not a question. Eliza sat at the Lund kitchen table, which was larger than the Brooks kitchen table, and considerably more heavily used, covered in the evidence of a family that actually lived in its kitchen, a mending basket, a child's drawing, 3 kinds of dried herb hanging from the rafters. Marta poured coffee and sat down across from her. She was 52 or near enough, with the particular physical economy of a woman who had been working hard for a long time and had developed an efficient relationship with every movement. She looked at Eliza with eyes that were assessing without being unkind. You're here about the council meeting, Marta said. And the supply situation, Eliza said. I heard you've had issues with territorial provisions. Who told you that? Alice Morrison. Marta made a sound that might have been a short laugh. Alice talks to people she trusts, Eliza said. I think that's a compliment. Marta wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Our contract with Territorial came up for renewal in September. The new terms were, she paused, different, higher, with some clauses about delivery timing that put the risk on us if their drivers were late.
Did you sign?
Not yet. Eric's been trying to find alternatives, but the options aren't good. There isn't another feed supplier within a distance that makes the cost work. There may be, Eliza said. I've been in contact with 2 suppliers in Laramie and 1 in Cheyenne. The pricing isn't perfect, but it's not prohibitive, especially if more than one operation is ordering. The delivery cost divides. Marta looked at her. You're talking about a buying group. I'm talking about 2 or 3 small operations coordinating their supply purchases to get volume pricing that none of them can get individually. She said it matter-of-factly. It's not complicated. It just requires people willing to work together. Marta was quiet for a moment. She had that quality Eliza had come to recognize in women of her generation, and situation a deep caution born from experience with things that sounded straightforward but turned out not to be. She was measuring Eliza against that caution, and Eliza understood that was the right thing to do, and did not try to rush it. Vale's had this county by the throat for a long time, Marta said finally. The people who've tried to push back haven't generally done well. No, Eliza agreed. They haven't. Mostly because they've pushed back individually, without documentation, without legal support, without a clear enough picture of the structure they were pushing against. She looked at Marta directly. I'm not promising this is going to be easy or that it's going to work cleanly. I'm saying that what I'm building is different from what's been tried before, and I'd like the Lund operation to be part of it, if you're willing. Marta looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was warm, and the dried herbs moved slightly in some draft from the window, and outside one of the children's voices said something to another that Eliza couldn't make out. The council meeting, Marta said. Yes, Eric will come. She said it. like the decision had already been made somewhere before Eliza arrived and just needed to be confirmed. And I'll talk to the Sorensen family. They've had their own situations. Eliza nodded. She felt something that was careful rather than triumphant, because she'd learned that careful was the right relationship to progress in a situation like this. Things could still go wrong. Things were probably going to go wrong in ways she hadn't anticipated. Progress was real and also provisional. Thank you, she said. It came out more plain than she intended, more unguarded, and Marta looked at her with a slight shift in expression that suggested she'd heard the genuine weight of it. Don't thank me yet, Marta said. Let's see what happens at that meeting first. Eliza drove back to Brooks Ranch in the cold morning light, and on the way back she thought about Roy's sister and the attorney's letter, and the Scheinbank, and the council meeting, and the 23 missing cattle, and the balloon clause that was still out there, ticking, and she thought that the next week was going to determine a very great deal about what happened after it. She had been in Red Hollow for 53 days. She had arrived with one bag, and the decision not to rush into anything she didn't understand. She understood quite a lot now. Whether it was enough was a question that the next week would answer. The road back to the ranch ran straight through the cold, clear morning, and she drove it with both hands on the reins and her eyes on what was ahead. The letter from Francis Aldrich arrived 2 days before the council meeting, and it was not the cautious, qualified response Eliza had half expected from a lawyer being asked to take on a case involving Edmund Vale. It was direct and specific and ran to 4 pages, which told Eliza immediately that Francis Aldrich had done her own research before writing back rather than simply responding to what the letter contained. Francis had looked into Frontier Credit Associates. She had found, through county records in Laramie, that the mortgage on Dora Hatch's boarding house had been transferred from its original holder to Frontier Credit Associates 11 months ago, not recently. Not in response to Roy's sworn statement, but 11 months ago, which meant the acquisition predated Roy's departure from Creekside and his arrival at Brooks Ranch. This was significant in a way that required a moment to absorb. It meant Vale had not targeted Dora's mortgage as retaliation. He had acquired it earlier, as part of a broader pattern of accumulating financial leverage over people in the region, a precautionary inventory of pressure points that could be activated when needed. He had not gone after Roy's sister because Roy talked. He had been positioned to go after Roy's sister whenever Roy became inconvenient, and Roy becoming inconvenient had simply activated something that was already in place. Eliza read this section of Francis's letter twice, and felt something that was not quite cold, but was adjacent to it, the recognition that the mechanism was larger and older than she'd understood, that the preparation behind it was more systematic, and that the people caught in it were caught not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had simply existed within reach. Francis's letter also said she would take the case, that she had seen enough in the county records to believe there were grounds to challenge the mortgage transfer and the new terms on procedural grounds, and that she would be in Red Hollow by Friday. She asked that Roy Hatch be available to speak with her, and she asked for a copy of every document Eliza had assembled. Eliza wrote back the same day, confirmed everything, and spent the evening making a clean copy of the full documentation file, the ownership records, the supply contract analysis, Roy's sworn statement, the loan terms breakdown, the correspondence with the banks, the physical evidence notes from the creek crossing. She organized it the way she had organized her father's mill accounts in the difficult years, not by date, but by category of harm, each section building on the one before it, so that a person reading it would understand not just the individual facts, but the structure connecting them. Nathaniel watched her work from across the table. He had his own papers in front of him, a letter from the Cheyenne Bank that had arrived that afternoon, which he had read and then set down with an expression she had learned to read, as this is significant, and I need a moment before I talk about it. She had given him the moment. Now he slid the letter across the table toward her. She picked it up. Garrett, the bank principal, had written back. Not through a subordinate, not through an attorney. He had written the letter himself, in the same slanted, impatient handwriting as his addendum, and it was the kind of letter that a person wrote when they had read something that confirmed something they'd suspected for a long time, and were prepared to act on it. He was coming to Red Hollow. He wanted to see the documentation in person. He had indicated, in language that was careful but not opaque, that the bank had prior experience with financial structures of the type Eliza had described, and that there was institutional interest in the question of whether the loan instrument on the Brooks property was enforceable as written. He's questioning the loan's validity, Eliza said. Can he do that? He's a bank, not a court. He can refuse to refinance on grounds of a flawed instrument, which forces Vale to actually foreclose if he wants to collect, which requires him to go to court, where the balloon clause and the way it was structured gets examined. She set the letter down. Vale has been counting on Nathaniel, accepting whatever terms were offered, rather than forcing a legal examination. If a bank is willing to put its own assessment of the instrument on record, that changes the calculation. Nathaniel looked at her. When is he coming? He doesn't say exactly. Soon, from the tone of it, she picked up her pen. I'm going to write to him tonight and suggest he come after the council meeting. I want him to see the full picture, and the council meeting is part of it. You think the meeting matters that much? I think it's where Vale is going to show his hand, she said, and I want Garrett to see the hand being shown. The morning of the council meeting arrived with a sky that had cleared overnight into the kind of cold, bright blue that made the Wyoming landscape look permanent and enormous and indifferent to whatever small human dramas were unfolding beneath it. Eliza was up before the light, which was not unusual. She stood in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn and drank coffee and looked at the documentation folder on the table and thought about what she knew and what she could prove and where those two territories were still not the same. She had been preparing for this meeting for 2 weeks. She knew that preparation was necessary and also that it was not sufficient. As a meeting with 5 council members, 2 of them foolses, 1 of them frightened, 2 of them genuinely independent but cautious, was not a situation you could fully script. Things would happen that she hadn't anticipated. Someone would say something unexpected. Vale would have prepared his own version of the situation, and it would be persuasive to people who hadn't seen the underlying structure. She was not, if she was honest with herself, certain how it was going to go. Nathaniel came in at first light already dressed, his hat on. He poured coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the yard the way he sometimes did, in the mornings, not anxiously, just gathering himself, the habit of a man who needed a few minutes of looking at his land before the day started properly. She had come to understand that this was important to him and had stopped filling those minutes with conversation. Roy knows about the meeting, he said. He knows. He's coming. Frances Aldrich? She arrived yesterday. She's at the hotel. Eliza had met with Frances for 2 hours the previous afternoon, a meeting that had been efficient and direct in the way of 2 people who shared a similar working style, which was to say they moved through the information without preamble and arrived at conclusions without needing to narrate the journey. Frances was 58, broad-shouldered, with silver haircut, practically short, and glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, lifting them to read and letting them drop the moment she was done. She had looked at Eliza's documentation folder, read it in 40 minutes, asked 6 specific questions and said, "This is good work. You've done most of what an attorney would do, and you're not an attorney. That's either impressive or alarming, and I've decided it's impressive." "The Lunds?" Nathaniel said. "Eric and Marta are bringing the Sorensens. That's 4 additional people in the room who aren't Vales." She paused. "Hobart I'm less sure about." She had spoken to Hobart herself 3 days ago. He was a rancher in his 60s, with the specific exhaustion of a man who had been worrying about the same problems for too long. He had listened to her, asked several questions, and said he needed to think. He had not committed. She had left him with a copy of the supply contract analysis, the section that showed how territorial provisions pricing had eroded operations across the valley, and had not pressed further, because pressing was how you made people feel cornered, and cornered people made decisions out of fear rather than judgment. Whether he would show up was still an open question. "However it goes today," Nathaniel said, still looking out the window, "you should know that what you've built, the documentation, the contacts, the way you've put it together, that stands regardless. Even if today doesn't go the way we need it to." She looked at him. "It needs to go the way we need it to." "I know, I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying," she said, "and I appreciate it. But I'd rather not have the consolation conversation until I know whether I need it." He almost smiled. Fair enough. They drove into Red Hollow together, which was the first time they had arrived somewhere together in a way that was visible to the town, and she was aware of this in the particular way of a person who has been the subject of other people's attention long enough to notice when the attention shifts. People on the main street watched the wagon come in. She did not look back at them. Frances Aldrich was waiting outside the council building, which was a modest structure that served as meeting hall, records office, and occasional courtroom. She had her briefcase and her glasses on their chain, and the expression of a woman who had been in many of these rooms before and found them neither intimidating nor particularly interesting, just the location where a certain kind of work got done. Eric and Marta Lund arrived 10 minutes later with the Sorensen couple, a quiet man and his wife who ran a sheep operation east of the Lunds and who had, Marta had told Eliza, been waiting for someone to do something about territorial provisions for 3 years. Roy came last, walking from the direction of the hotel where he'd spent the previous night, his hat on, and his expression set in the careful neutral of a man who understood he was about to be in a room with people who might know his name. They went in. The council chamber was a rectangular room with a long table at the front for the 5 members and rows of chairs for whoever attended, which was usually nobody except the people directly affected by whatever was being decided. Today there were perhaps 20 people in the chairs, which was notable for Red Hollow, where civic participation was not strong. Word had spread that something significant was on the agenda. Red Hollow was small enough that significant things gathered observers. The council members were already seated. The 2 Vale men, Alderman Pierce and Alderman Connell, sat at one end with the practiced ease of people who knew how the day was going to go. The 2 genuinely independent members, a woman named Vera Osgood, who ran the schoolhouse and served on the council with the weary dedication of someone who did it because nobody else would, and a hardware merchant named Dabrowski, who had his own views and expressed them regardless of consequence, sat at the other end. Hobart was in the middle, visibly uncomfortable, his hands flat on the table in front of him. Edmund Vale was not on the council. He was in the room, seated in the front row of the chairs, which was a choice that communicated something specific. He was here as a private citizen, as an observer, as someone whose interests were coincidentally aligned with whatever the council was about to do. He did not look at Eliza when she came in. That was also a choice. The council chairman, Alderman Pierce, called the meeting to order and moved through 2 items of ordinary business with the speed of a man who wanted to get to the main event. Then he introduced the item that Vale had placed on the agenda, which was described as a discussion of compliance requirements for ranch operations within the county boundary, with particular attention to fence maintenance and livestock management obligations. It was exactly what she'd expected. She had the relevant county ordinances in the documentation folder, already tabbed. Pierce began with a prepared statement about the importance of maintaining proper fence lines along property boundaries, the county's obligation to ensure livestock did not cross between registered range parcels, and the available remedies when ranchers failed to meet those obligations. He did not name the Brooks Ranch. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew who this was about. When he finished, Eliza stood up. Pierce looked at her with the expression of a man who had not planned for participation from the chairs. "This is a council discussion, Miss Hartwell," she said. Eliza Hartwell. "I'm here as a representative of Brooks Ranch, which I believe is the operation under discussion, though I notice it hasn't been named directly." She said it without aggression. "Just precisely. I'd like to speak to the fence compliance question." Vera Osgood said, "The floor allows public comment on agenda items." "Let her speak," Dabrowski nodded. Pierce looked briefly toward the front row. Vale's expression remained neutral. "Go ahead," Pierce said. Eliza opened the folder. She took out the first document, the fence inspection record she had personally compiled, with dates and conditions, and the specific sections of county ordinance applicable to each segment of the Brooks boundary line. "The Brooks Ranch fence line was inspected by me on 3 separate dates in October," she said. "The current condition of every segment is documented here, including the creek crossing section on the east boundary, which I'd like to address specifically." She set the document on the table in front of the council. "The creek crossing fence has been repaired and is currently in compliance with county standards. The prior condition of that section, and the reason it was in a degraded state, is also documented." Connell leaned forward. "The prior condition is what's at issue. If livestock crossed, livestock did cross," Eliza said. "We have documentation of that as well. What I'd like the council to understand is the reason the fence was in a state that permitted that crossing, which is materially relevant to the compliance question." She took out the second document, Roy's sworn statement. She did not read it aloud. She summarized it, that the creek crossing fence section had been deliberately maintained in a degraded condition to allow the movement of livestock from Brooks Range to the adjacent creekside operation, that this movement had occurred on multiple occasions, and that the livestock in question had not been strays, but had been moved deliberately by persons employed by the creekside operation. The room changed. Not loudly, but something shifted in the quality of the air, the particular shift that happens when a conversation that was going one direction suddenly encounters information that points another way, Pierce said. "That's a serious allegation." "It's a sworn statement," Frances said from her chair beside Eliza. She had not stood. She had simply spoken, in the measured tone of a person who does not need to raise their voice to be heard. Frances Aldrich, attorney at law. The statement was given under oath before Justice Harlan Pruitt in Clearwater County. "I can provide the documentation." Hobart was looking at the table. Vale in the front row had shifted slightly in his chair, not dramatically. But Eliza was watching him and she saw it. "The Creekside operation," Dabrowski said. He was looking at the ownership records Eliza had placed on the table. "That property is registered to Red Hollow Land and Livestock Management. Is that correct?" "That's correct," Eliza said. "The ownership records are public. Copies are in this folder." She looked at the council. The same company holds the controlling interest in territorial provisions, which holds supply contracts with a significant number of ranch operations in this county. I have documentation of the pricing structure of those contracts, which shows a consistent pattern of above-market rates that has been applied across multiple operations over a period of several years, Marta Lund said, from her seat in the chairs. That's our contract. Vera Osgood looked at Marta. You're saying your operation has experienced the same pricing? 31% above the market rate I checked with a Laramie supplier last month, Marta said. She had brought her own papers. She had not told Eliza she was going to do this, and Eliza had not asked her to. She had simply shown up prepared, which was its own kind of an answer about what Marta Lund was made of. Sorensen said, ours too. The council was very still. Pierce said, this is not what this agenda item was called to address. No, Eliza said. It was called to address fence compliance. I've addressed fence compliance. The fence is compliant. The reason it was previously non-compliant is relevant to the council's understanding of the situation. She looked at him steadily. If the council wants to act on fence compliance, it should understand that the non-compliance was a product of deliberate outside interference with the Brooks property, and that acting on it without that context would be acting on an incomplete picture. Pierce looked at Vale. It was a brief look, involuntary almost. The look of a man checking with someone, and immediately understanding that he had just made visible something he intended to keep invisible. Vera Osgood saw it, Dabrowski saw it, several people in the chairs saw it. Hobart looked up from the table for the first time. He looked at Pierce, then at Vale, then back at Pierce. Something moved across his face that was slow and not entirely comfortable, the expression of a man whose calculation has been running in one direction and has just encountered information that requires him to run it again. I'd like to table this agenda item, Hobart said. Pierce stared at him. Alderman Hobart. I'd like to table it, Hobart said again. He had the voice of a man who has made a decision and is holding it by both hands. There are questions here that the council hasn't had the chance to review properly. We shouldn't act on an item we haven't fully reviewed. Connell said, we've reviewed. I haven't, Hobart said. The room was very quiet. Vera Osgood said, I'll second the motion to table. Pierce looked at Vale again. Vale's face was neutral, and Eliza, watching him, thought he was the kind of man who was very good at neutral, and that neutral right now was working hard. The motion to table is before the council, Pierce said, in the voice of a man who knows the count and doesn't like it. In favor? Hobart. Osgood Dabrowski. 3. The item was tabled. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes, through genuinely routine business that nobody was paying attention to. When it ended, the room emptied in the particular way of a space where something significant has happened, and people need to move and talk and process it. Vale left quickly without speaking to anyone, which was itself a statement. A man accustomed to being the gravitational center of these rooms was leaving one before the room had finished moving. Hobart caught Eliza near the door. He was a big man, and his voice, when he used it, had the qualities of something that had been sitting in him for a while and had finally found the door. The supply contract, he said, the pricing analysis you gave me. Yes, she said. My numbers are worse than that document shows, he said. I've been paying territorial for 4 years. Do you have the invoices? All of them. I keep everything. He looked at her with an expression that was an uncomfortable mixture of things embarrassment, probably, at how long he'd let it run without acting, and something that wanted to be called relief but wasn't quite there yet. What do I do with them? Bring them to Frances Aldrich, Eliza said. She's the attorney who spoke today. She's at the hotel through the weekend. He nodded. He put his hat on and looked at her once more, and then went out into the cold, bright morning without another word. Sometimes the significant things happen that way without speeches, without visible transformation, just a big, quiet man putting on his hat and making a decision to do the thing that should have been done a long time ago. Frances appeared at Eliza's elbow. Hobart's going to be useful, she said. 4 years of invoices is a paper trail, I know. The council tabling the item is good but temporary. Vale has 2 votes and will bring it back. Not before we have the bank conversation, Eliza said, and not with the same presentation, because now the room knows the context. She looked at Frances. How is the Hatch mortgage case moving, Frances said. The transfer documentation has procedural problems I can work with. It won't be fast, but it'll hold him off while we build. She looked at Eliza with an expression that had something like professional respect in it, which was not a thing Frances gave out freely. You did well in there. We did well in there, Eliza said. Marta Lund brought her own numbers, I noticed. Frances snapped her briefcase closed. I'm going to speak to Sorensen before he leaves. This would help, too. She moved off. Eliza stood in the emptying room and allowed herself 2 minutes of not doing anything, just standing, letting the past 2 hours settle into a shape she could evaluate. It had gone better than the worst version she'd imagined, and not as cleanly as the best version. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and that was fine. Real progress was rarely neat. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. He had been in the chairs during the meeting, and she had been aware of him the way you become aware of a person you've come to trust in a room where things are uncertain, not looking at him, but knowing he was there. Hobart, he said. I know. I didn't think he'd do it. People do unexpected things when they're given information they didn't have before, she said. He'd been making a decision based on an incomplete picture. The picture changed. He looked at her. Vale's going to regroup. Yes. He's good at it. She picked up the documentation folder. But regrouping takes time, and we're not standing still while he does it. They walked out into the cold morning together, and the light was the particular winter clarity that made everything look precise and far away, and the town of Red Hollow continued its ordinary activity around them as if nothing had happened. Which was not exactly true, but was the way small towns absorbed significant things, slowly, privately, one person at a time, adjusting their understanding of how things were. Garrett arrived from Cheyenne on the following Thursday. On the afternoon stage, and Eliza met him at the depot because Nathaniel had a fence emergency in the north pasture. A section had come down in the night, and 3 steers had gotten into a neighboring field, requiring the particular unglamorous work of retrieving cattle and making repairs in cold mud. And because Garrett's time was limited and waiting for Nathaniel to get back was not an efficient use of it, he was shorter than she'd expected from his handwriting, which was the kind of observation that made no logical sense but that she had anyway. He was perhaps 60, with a neat gray beard and the particular focused quality of a man who was almost always thinking about something specific and useful. He shook her hand without any of the hesitation that men sometimes showed when the hand being extended was a woman's, which she noted and appreciated. Miss Hartwell, he said, your letters are the most organized correspondence I've received from a non-attorney in 12 years of banking. I'll take that as a compliment, she said. It is one. He picked up his own bag. Is there somewhere we can work? She brought him to the ranch, showed him the kitchen table and the documentation folder, poured coffee, and sat across from him while he read. He read faster than she expected and asked better questions than she'd anticipated, which meant he understood financial structures at a level she had not been certain she could assume. He was particularly interested in the balloon clause. He read the original loan document 3 times, each time with his glasses on, and a slight forward lean that indicated genuine engagement with something that was puzzling him. This clause, he said, the specific language of the trigger. Yes, she said. It's written to look like a standard balloon instrument, but the trigger condition is vague enough that Vale's attorney could argue it was activated earlier than the stated date, or later, depending on which argument was needed. That's what I thought, she said. The ambiguity is built in. It's not an accident, Garrett said. He set the document down and looked at her. This was written by someone who knew exactly what they were creating. This clause is designed to be interpreted whichever way suits the holder at the moment of collection. He paused. A court would look at this very carefully. Would a court invalidate it? I'm not in a position to say that, he said. What I can say is that this bank would not have issued this instrument. And what I can also say is that we are not going to refinance a property with this instrument standing as the prior claim because we can't properly assess the collateral value when there's a legally ambiguous claim that could be activated in multiple ways by the prior holder. He looked at her steadily. That's our formal position. Eliza understood what he was not quite saying. By refusing to refinance with the instrument standing, the bank was putting its institutional assessment of the loan's validity on record. That assessment was not a legal ruling, but it was a documented professional opinion from a lending institution. And a documented professional opinion from a lending institution was exactly the kind of thing that mattered when the situation eventually went to a court. We appreciate that, she said. The cattle situation, he said. The sworn statement and the physical evidence. That's sheriff territory. I know, I've been building toward it. She paused. I wanted to have the financial documentation complete before I brought the sheriff in, because I didn't want the criminal element addressed in isolation from the broader context. If the sheriff addresses the cattle theft without understanding the loan and supply structure, Vale has room to present it as an isolated incident. Garrett looked at her for a moment. You've thought about this carefully. I've had time to think, she said. He almost smiled. When are you going to the sheriff after this conversation, she said. The complete picture is now documented. It's time. He nodded. He looked around the kitchen at the herbs on the counter, the mended curtains at the window, the evidence of a household that had been brought back to life from something much closer to empty, and he said, How long have you been here? Just past 2 months, she said. He looked at her again, in the particular way that people who were paying attention looked at things that didn't fit their expectations in a useful direction. The ranch is doing better, he said. It was not a question. He'd reviewed the operational accounts. It's doing better, she agreed. Not fixed, but better. Better is what banks lend against, he said. Fixed is what gets written up in newspapers, and newspapers aren't my business. He closed his briefcase. I'll have a formal proposal for refinancing on your desk. I'll send it to the ranch within the week. The terms will be what they should have been from the beginning. The balloon clause on the current loan is a problem, and I'll have our legal team assess what options exist for addressing it before we finalize. That may take some time. Time we'll use, she said. He stood. She walked him back out to the yard where his hired buggy was waiting. The afternoon was cold, and the light was going, the sun already dropping behind the western hills with that quick Wyoming finality that still caught her off guard some days, the way the light didn't fade gradually, but simply decided it was done. Miss Hartwell, Garrett said before he got up into the buggy. He said it in the tone of a man who has something to say that doesn't fit neatly into professional language. The situation you've described, the supply structure, the loan instrument, the adjacent property, I've seen versions of this in 3 other counties in this state. In every other case I'm aware of, the operation being pressured eventually capitulated or failed. She waited. What's different here, he said, is the documentation, and the fact that you connected the individual pieces into a picture before approaching anyone. He paused. Most people come to us with one problem. You came with the whole structure. He settled into the buggy. That matters. I want you to know that it matters. He drove out. She stood in the yard in the gathering cold and thought about what he'd said, and about the 3 counties and the operations that had capsized, and the people who'd been in those operations. She thought about the specific weight of knowing that what she was doing was not unique in its problem, and might not be unique in its solution, and that the difference between those who'd made it and those who hadn't was sometimes as plain and exhausting as doing the work of documentation that nobody else had done. Nathaniel came back from the north pasture at dusk, cold and mud-streaked, and with the particular expression of a man who has retrieved cattle from a neighboring field twice in one day, and is prepared to accept that this is the kind of day the frontier sometimes delivered. He came into the kitchen and saw Eliza at the table and stopped. How did it go? She told him. She told him about Garrett's assessment of the balloon clause, the bank's formal position, the refinancing proposal coming by letter, the conversation about the sheriff. She told it in order, the way she told most things, and he listened the way he'd learned to listen to her, without interrupting, without jumping ahead, waiting for the full picture before he responded. When she finished, he sat down. He put both hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment. The sheriff, he said. That's the part I keep getting stuck on. Because of the cattle? Because I've known Sheriff Ames for 11 years, he said. He's not Vale's man, but he's not someone who makes trouble for powerful people without very good reason. He looked at her. Do we have very good reason? We have a sworn statement, physical evidence, documented ownership connections, and a bank's formal assessment of financial misconduct, she said. That's better than very good reason. That's a case. He absorbed this when? Tomorrow morning, she said. I'd like you to come. I'll come. She got up to start dinner because it was that time of day and dinner still needed making regardless of what else was happening, and she was standing at the stove with an onion in her hand when Nathaniel said, from the table, Eliza. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had been filing away, and not naming since the early weeks the one she now understood, was the particular way a person looked at someone they had come to depend on, and were in the process of realizing, somewhat uncomfortably, that depending on them was not purely a practical matter anymore. I need to ask you something, he said. She set the onion down. She waited. Are you staying? He said. It came out simpler than anything he'd said in weeks, which was often how the important things came out, stripped of the careful language people built around them and left plain. I know that's your decision, and I know I said I wouldn't press it. But we're about to go to the sheriff, and then the bank, and then whatever comes after that, and I need to know whether I'm building something that's going to continue, or whether— He stopped. I need to know. She looked at him across the kitchen. 2 months and 3 weeks since the stage depot. The supper she hadn't made yet. The folder on the table with its 60 days of accumulated documentation. The kitchen that smelled like coffee and the particular dry, cold smell of a Wyoming November coming through the window seams. She had been thinking about this question since the second week, in the way of a person who knew the answer was forming, but wasn't going to force it before it was ready. She had told herself she was not the kind of woman who made permanent decisions under pressure. She had told herself that clarity required time. What she understood now, standing in this kitchen with an onion in her hand and the last of the daylight going, was that she had been certain for at least 3 weeks, and had been very carefully not quite admitting it. Yes, she said, I'm staying. He was quiet for a moment. Not because it surprised him exactly, but because hearing it plainly was different from almost knowing it, and he was giving the difference its due. Good, he said. He did not make a production of it. That was exactly right. She picked up the onion and started dinner, and he got up and washed the pasture mud from his hands at the basin. And outside the Wyoming dark came down with its enormous patient indifference. And inside the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was lit, and the documentation folder sat on the table waiting for morning. The sheriff's office was tomorrow. The bank proposal was coming by letter. Francis Aldrich was in a hotel room 2 towns over, working through Hobart's 4 years of invoices. Roy Hatch was in the bunkhouse 2 towns over from his sister, who was not going to lose her boarding house if Francis had anything to say about it. Marta Lund had gone home with her own papers and a lawyer's card. Garrett was on the stage back to Cheyenne with a case in his briefcase and a formal proposal to write. None of it was finished. Most of it was still uncertain. There were things that could still go wrong, and some of them would, because this was the actual frontier, and not a story about it, and the actual frontier was indifferent to what you deserved, and mostly interested in what you could hold together against the cold and the distance, and the particular human capacity for organized cruelty that men like Edmund Vale had turned into. Something that looked from a certain angle like commerce. But the structure was visible now, and structures that were visible could be challenged. Eliza had made sure of that. Sheriff Ames was a man who had survived 21 years in a frontier county by being slow to move and nearly impossible to reverse once he did. He was 63, built like someone had assembled him from spare parts that didn't quite match long arms, short torso, a head that seemed slightly too large for the rest, and he listened to people with a quality of attention that felt almost uncomfortable, like being read by someone who had learned to read in difficult conditions and took nothing at face value. He listened to Eliza for 40 minutes. He looked at the documentation. He read Roy's statement twice. He asked 7 questions, all of them specific, none of them hostile. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, "The creek crossing evidence. You left it intact, documented and photographed," Eliza said. "The fence has been repaired because livestock management required it, but the ground pattern is still visible, and I have written descriptions of the condition on 3 separate dates before the repair." And the young man who gave the statement, Roy Hatch, he's at Brooks Ranch. He'll speak to you directly. Ames looked at Nathaniel, who had said very little during the meeting, not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd understood from the first 5 minutes that this was a conversation that Eliza needed to run, and that his role was to be present and credible rather than argumentative. "You've been aware of this how long?" Ames asked him. "The full picture? About 6 weeks," Nathaniel said. "Before that, I knew there were missing animals. I didn't know the structure behind it." Ames nodded slowly. He was a man who understood the difference between a person who had sat on information and a person who had assembled it before bringing it forward, and the documentation in front of him told that story clearly enough. He pulled the stack of papers toward him and squared the edges against the desk, in the particular way of someone who had made a decision and was organizing the physical space around it. "I'll ride out to the creek crossing this week," he said. "I'll want to speak to Hatch directly, and I'll want a formal written record of the ownership connections between Creekside and Vale's corporate structure, because when this goes to the county attorney, it needs to be tight." "I have that prepared," Eliza said. She set a separate folder on his desk. Everything connected in order, with source citations. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. "You've done this before," he said. "Not this specifically," she said, "but similar work." "You should have been a lawyer," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment and wasn't quite a criticism, more like an observation about the particular way the world distributed useful skills. "I didn't have access to law school," she said, not bitterly, just factually. "But I had my father's accounts and 11 years of watching what happened when people didn't document things properly." Ames stood, which was the signal that the meeting was concluding. He shook Nathaniel's hand and then, after a brief pause that acknowledged the slight awkwardness of the gesture in 1887, shook Eliza's as well. "I'll be in touch within the week," he said. "In the meantime, nothing provocative. No direct contact with anyone at Creekside or with Vale. Let this move through the proper channels." "That's exactly what I intend," Eliza said. What happened next did not happen quickly. That was the truth of it. The part that was hardest to hold in a situation that had been running at the pace of crisis for 2 months. The machinery of proper channels moved at its own speed, which was slower than urgency and faster than despair. And living inside that pace required a particular kind of patience that Eliza had developed over years, and that still, on certain evenings when she was tired and the uncertainty was loud, was genuinely hard. The county attorney reviewed the documentation in December. He asked for 2 additional pieces of information, a formal valuation of the missing livestock and a title search on the Creekside property going back further than Eliza had gone. Frances handled the title search, which she had already anticipated and had begun before the request came. The livestock valuation required Ames to make an official count of the Creekside herd, and compare it against Eliza's documented gap in the Brooks calving records, which required a court order, which required the county attorney to have enough confidence in the case to request one. He requested it in the third week of December. Edmund Vale, who had been informed by his attorney of every procedural development as it happened, made a decision in late December that Eliza had not predicted, but that, when she heard about it, she recognized as the decision of a man who understood that certain kinds of fights, once the ground shifted far enough, were better settled than continued. He did not call her. He did not come to the ranch again. He had his attorney contact Francis Aldrich with a proposal. Francis brought it to the ranch on a gray afternoon 2 days before the new year, spread it on the kitchen table, and said, "Read it before you react." Eliza read it. Nathaniel read it after her. Neither of them reacted immediately, which was the right response to a legal settlement proposal. You read it. You thought about it. You did not let the relief of its existence make you accept terms that weren't adequate. The proposal was this. Vale would release the balloon clause on the Brooks loan and accept restructured repayment terms consistent with market rates. He would dissolve the territorial provisions contracts with the Brooks Ranch, the Lund operation, and the Sorensen operation. He would sell the Creekside property to a third party, not a Vale-connected entity, within 6 months. He would pay a negotiated sum to Nathaniel Brooks in acknowledgement of the livestock that had been moved from Brooks Range, the figure based on the county valuation. And the mortgage on Dora Hatch's boarding house would be transferred back to its original holder at the original terms. In exchange, the criminal referral to the county attorney would be withdrawn, and all parties would agree to a confidentiality provision regarding the specifics of the settlement. Eliza read the confidentiality provision twice.
No, she's...
Francis looked at her. The rest of the terms are defensible. The rest of the terms are fair, Eliza said. The confidentiality provision isn't. If Vale's structures have done this to Brooks Ranch and the Lund operation and the Sorensen operation, they've done it to others. A confidentiality provision means those other people can't use what we know to help their own situations. Refusing it could mean the criminal case goes to trial, Francis said. Trial takes time, it's not certain. I know that, Eliza said. Nathaniel had been listening. He looked at Eliza and then at Francis and then back at Eliza. What's the alternative, he said. We counter, Eliza said. We accept every term except the confidentiality provision. We make the settlement public record, which it already is unless both parties agree to seal it. We give up nothing about what happened in exchange for the financial resolution. Francis was quiet for a moment. She was thinking, which was what she did when she had a view, but wanted to make sure it was the right view before she expressed it. Vale will push back, she said. He might, Eliza said. Or he might decide that a public settlement is survivable in a way that a criminal trial is not. She looked at the proposal. He's already agreed to terms that cost him significantly. He got here because the documentation was too complete to ignore. He's not going to reverse that calculation over a confidentiality clause he knows I'm going to reject. Francis picked up the proposal and looked at it with the expression of an attorney who has decided that her client is right and is updating her own recommendation accordingly. I'll draft the counter, she said. Give me an hour. She had the counter drafted in 40 minutes. Vale's attorney responded within 3 days. The confidentiality provision was removed. The settlement was finalized in the first week of January and filed as public record at the county courthouse, which meant anyone who walked into that building and asked for it could read exactly what Edmund Vale had agreed to and why. Hobart came to the ranch the day after the settlement was filed. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. It was a cold, clear morning, the kind that made the air feel like glass, and he said, I want to thank you. Thank Francis Aldrich, Eliza said, and yourself for bringing the invoices. Francis Aldrich didn't come to a council meeting on 60 days of being in this county, Hobart said. He said it gruffly, because he was a gruff man, but he meant it without gruffness. I've been here 20 years. I know what it cost, and I know what it took, and I know I wasn't the one who did it. She looked at him. You voted to table the item, she said. When it mattered, you did the right thing. That's not nothing. He put his hat back on and went home, and she stood in the yard after he'd gone and thought about what he'd said, which was true and also incomplete in the way that most true things are, because the question of what it had cost was one she'd been living inside for 3 months and had not yet answered for herself, not fully. The refinancing closed in February. Garrett himself came for the signing, which he did not have to do, but which he apparently considered appropriate given the circumstances. He brought 2 junior staff and a great deal of paperwork, and the closing happened at the kitchen table, because the kitchen table was where everything happened at Brooks Ranch now. And afterward, Garrett shook Nathaniel's hand and said, The rates are what they should have been from the beginning. I'm sorry it took this route to get there, Nathaniel said. It got there. That's what matters. Garrett looked at Eliza. I told you in the yard that the documentation was what made the difference, he said. I want to be more specific about that now because I think it deserves specificity. He picked up his hat. 3 other ranch operations in this state came to us in situations similar to yours. All 3 had complaints. All 3 had some records. None of them had what you had: the complete picture, the connected ownership structure, the legal analysis of the loan instrument's ambiguity. He paused. All 3 of those operations are no longer operating. 2 of them foreclosed. 1 sold under pressure at a price that didn't come close to the property's value. The kitchen was quiet. What you built here, he said, is the difference between those outcomes and yours. I want you to know that clearly. He left with his staff, and the kitchen held that statement in the cold morning air. Nathaniel sat with his coffee and didn't say anything for a while, and Eliza understood that he was sitting with the weight of the 3 operations that weren't there anymore, the ranchers who had faced the same mechanism without the tools to dismantle it, and that sitting with that weight was the honest response to being the one who made it through. We got lucky, he said finally. Not self-deprecating, just accurate. We got lucky that I happened to know how to read accounts, she said, and that Roy happened to have a conscience, and that Frances Aldrich happened to be the kind of attorney she is. She looked at her coffee. Yes, we got lucky. That's real, she paused, but luck isn't the whole story. You have to be in a position to use it when it shows up. He looked at her across the table. 3 months and change since the stage depot. The kitchen was different now, not dramatically, not in ways a stranger would notice, but in the ways that people who'd been watching the same space transform could see. The herbs on the counter that she'd grown from seed in a window box. The curtains in the kitchen that matched the ones she'd made for the bunkhouse. The accounts ledger on the shelf, current and organized, with a second ledger beside it now, because the operation had grown enough to need the separation of categories. The operation had grown. That was the thing that had happened gradually enough to almost miss, while the legal situation was resolving, while the documents were being assembled and the settlement was being negotiated. The ranch itself had been doing what ranches do when they're properly supplied and decently managed, and the people working them feel like they're working for something real. The spring calving count was the best in 4 years. Roy had turned out to be better with horses than cattle and had taken over the breaking operation, which had freed Clem and Pete for fence and water management. The kitchen garden that Eliza had put in through the fall was producing more than she'd expected, and she'd started drying and storing in a way that was building toward actual self-sufficiency in the small daily supplies that had previously required trips to town. None of it was finished. None of it was perfect. The fence on the south boundary still needed a full replacement that they didn't yet have the budget for. One of the stock horses had gone lame in January, and the replacement was expensive. The accounts showed progress, but also the ongoing reality of a cattle operation, which was that things could go wrong in ways that had nothing to do with Edmund Vale: a bad winter, a disease moving through the herd, a dry summer on the range, and that the margin between stable and struggling was always thinner than you wanted it to be. But it was stable, and stable after what it had been felt like a form of abundance. Spring came to Red Hollow in the particular way it came to Wyoming: reluctantly, then all at once, then uncertainly again, the weather unable to commit until it did. The town itself had changed in small ways. Territorial provisions had been bought out by its Laramie competitor at a price that reflected its actual market value rather than its artificial one, and the new supply arrangements that Eliza had been coordinating, the loose buying group that now included the Brooks Ranch, the Lunds, the Sorensens, and Hobart, were running at rates that were, for the first time in years, honest. Edmund Vale was still in Red Hollow. This was the part that some people found unsatisfying about how things resolved the expectation that a man who had done what he'd done would be visibly punished, driven out, made to suffer in ways proportional to what he'd caused. He was not. He was still in his office above the supply depot, still managing the operations he had not had to sell, still a significant economic presence in the county. The criminal referral had been withdrawn as part of the settlement. He had paid a sum that cost him something but did not destroy him. He had lost ground, and the loss of ground was real, but it was not the kind of ending that stories usually provided for men who operated the way he had operated. Eliza thought about this. She thought about it on an April morning when she was in the kitchen garden, turning the season's first soil, the ground cold and resisting but softening under the work. And she thought about the 3 operations that Garrett had mentioned that were no longer operating. She thought about the ranch hands who'd worked those operations and the families who'd lived in those houses and the accumulated years of people's lives that had been ground up by a mechanism that was legal enough on the surface and wrong enough underneath to matter. Vale had not been destroyed, but the mechanism had been made visible, and visible things were harder to operate in the dark. and the documentation was public record in a county courthouse where it would sit for as long as paper held. That was not satisfaction, exactly. It was something more durable than satisfaction. It was the difference between a feeling and a fact. She was still on her knees in the garden when Nathaniel came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down on the porch step and handed her one without preamble. She sat back on her heels and took it. "Clem's talking about retiring," he said. "I know, he told me." "He told you before he told me?" "He told me 2 weeks ago," she said. "I didn't want to say anything until he'd talked to you." Nathaniel looked at the yard, at the barn where Clem had kept a particular order for 9 years. "He's got family in Nebraska," he said. "He mentioned a sister," Eliza said. "I knew that." He turned the coffee cup. "Roy could take over what Clem does." "Roy's better with the horses than anything else," she said. "You'd want to build around that rather than move him into Clem's general role. Hire someone specific for the cattle management." He looked at her. "You already have someone in mind. There's a man named Anders who worked for the Lund operation and is looking for a change." Marta mentioned him. "He's got 15 years of cattle work." She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "I said I'd have you contact him." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had stopped trying to name, because naming it would have made it into a category. And it was more specific than any category. It was the expression of a man who had built a life on land he loved and had lost his grip on it, and had had it returned to him through a combination of circumstances that he was still not entirely able to account for, and who was living, every day, inside the specific gratitude of that. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. He had said it before months ago in this same yard. He said it again now, not because he'd forgotten, but because it was still true and still worth saying. "I know," she said. "Same answer as last time. I mean it differently now," he said. "Then I meant it practically. Now I mean." He stopped. He was not a man who found this kind of language easy, and she had learned not to help him through it prematurely, because what he said when he found his own way to it was always more honest than anything she might have offered. "I mean that you could have been anywhere, could have answered a different letter, from a different man, in a different territory. Could have stayed in Pennsylvania." He looked at his coffee. "I'm glad you ended up here." She looked at him across the yard in the April morning, the light thin and new, and the smell of turned earth around her, and the ranch making its ordinary sounds horses in the corral, someone's boot on the bunkhouse step, the particular Wyoming wind that she had come to think of not as hostile anymore but as honest, the way honest things were sometimes hard. She was 34 years old and had arrived in this place with one bag and considerable uncertainty, and the practical capability she'd spent 12 years building in a household that needed it, and the specific stubbornness of a person who had watched too many careful plans fall apart due to insufficient documentation. She was not the woman she had been in September. Not because Wyoming had changed her. The frontier did not transform people the way stories claimed. It mostly just revealed what was already there. But because she had done things here that she had not known she was capable of, and knowing you are capable of a thing changes the shape of what you believe is possible next. "The ownership papers," she said. He looked at her. "What about them?" "Garrett mentioned that the refinancing documents have both our names on them as co-operators of the ranch," she said, "for the bank's purposes, for collateral assessment. But the title is still in your name only." He was very still. "I'm not asking for it," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not raising it as a negotiation." She held his gaze. "I'm raising it because I want you to decide what you want, with a clear understanding of what you'd be deciding." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the wind moved through the yard twice, and the horses settled in the corral, and Pete walked across the yard toward the barn without noticing them and disappeared inside. "I want your name on it," he said. "I've wanted that for a while. I didn't know how to say it without it seeming like—" He paused. "Without it seeming like I was trying to hold you here with paperwork." She almost laughed. "Not quite. I'm already here," she said. "I told you that in December. I know you did. Then it's not paperwork holding me here. It's just paperwork being accurate." He looked at her with the expression she had finally, privately named. It was the expression of a man looking at the person who made his life make sense. Not because he couldn't function without her, he was not that kind of man, and she would not have stayed for that kind of man, but because the life he was building now was more honest and more complete and more worth the work than anything he'd been able to build alone, and that truth was visible in his face every time he looked at her and didn't bother to hide it. "Francis can draw up the papers," he said. "Francis would appreciate the business," Eliza said. The deed was amended in May. It was not a ceremony. Francis came to the ranch, notarized the amendment, filed a copy with the county recorder, and had coffee in the kitchen before driving back. It was a document, and documents were what they were: paper, ink, legal language. What they represented was larger than the paper. But the paper was necessary, because Eliza had learned everything she knew about the fragility of unrecorded arrangements. Eliza Hartwell, co-owner of Brooks Ranch, Red Hollow, Wyoming, on the record. She stood in the kitchen that evening after Francis had gone, and Nathaniel was in the barn with Roy and Clem, doing the last feeding of the day, and she held the copy of the amended deed and looked at her name on it. It was strange, the feeling that came with it. Not triumph. Something quieter. The feeling of a thing being true that you had not known how to want, that you had come to through a series of practical decisions, and that had turned out to be more important than the practical decisions that led to it. She thought about the women she had known in Pennsylvania who had spent their lives as components of other people's arrangements. Her mother, who had been capable and constrained in equal measure. Her sister, who was young enough to have options that hadn't existed a generation earlier. She thought about the mail-order bride story that Red Hollow had told about her, the outsider who arrived with big ideas and would eventually be worn down to the appropriate size. She thought about Clara Whitmore's careful cruelties and the laughter at the stage depot and the supply clerk who had watched her order muslin and waited for her to flinch. Nobody had broken her. She had not been broken. Not because she was exceptional. She had made mistakes, misjudged timing, worried about the wrong things in November, been surprised by the depth of the mechanism she was dealing with. She was not a story's version of herself, competent and fearless and certain. She was a woman who had been afraid several times and had done the next thing anyway, because the next thing was visible and doable, and because stopping was not an option she was willing to take. That was the truth of it, not heroism, just the refusal to stop. The thing about the frontier that the stories didn't adequately convey was that it didn't care about your intentions. It didn't reward goodness or punish cruelty in any reliable or timely way. It was simply a place that applied pressure, and what you were made of showed up in how you held under that pressure, and most people, this was the thing. Most people held better than they thought they would. Not perfectly. Not without damage. But they held Roy Hatch had held when it would have been easier to walk away and keep quiet. Hobart had held when a single vote in a council meeting could have gone differently. Marta Lund had shown up with her own papers and her own numbers because she had been waiting for someone to do something and had understood at a certain moment that she could be part of the someone. People were not generally the problem. The structures that ran on people's fear were the problem. And structures could be documented, and documented things could be challenged. And challenges didn't always win, but they always mattered. Because the next person who came along and found themselves in the same structure would find the record of what had been done before. And that record was its own kind of inheritance. She put the deed in the folder where she kept the ranch's important documents. Then she started dinner, because it was that time of day, and the work continued the way it always did. And that was exactly as it should be. Outside, the Wyoming spring moved through the ranch in its unhurried way, warming the ground by degrees, and the creek to the east ran fuller than it had in years, and the cattle in the south pasture were fat and settled, and the fence at the creek crossing held.